The halls of the palace whispered with illusion. Even the breeze seemed rehearsed, slipping through the lattice screens not with freedom, but as if it too had learned to carry only fragrance. Scented with kiffy and resin, the air lulled every guest into a dream, convincing the nose before the eyes could even focus. But beneath this cloud of floral deceit, skin festered and sweat thickened. The pharaoh's wives, robed in linen as sheer as whispers, bore their beauty like a shield, but it was one crusted with the weight of hidden filth. Their bodies were temples only in name. No river had blessed them, only oil had masked them. The perfumes that grazed their flesh did not clean it covered. Each morning, before the sun even struck the temple obelisks, their servants opened wooden boxes filled with pastes of myrrh, pressed lotus, and oils as golden as the gods' tears. These were rubbed into the creases of elbows and thighs, smeared across armpits until scent triumphed over truth. The women would then step into gowns that clung to the body, trapping heat and sweat between folds of sacred cloth. Linen, once white, darkened by noon, but no one looked beneath the sheen. Water, though life-giving, was never abundant enough for luxury. The Nile's blessings were rationed, its use reserved for ceremonies, irrigation, and the spirits of the dead. For the living, especially royal women, bathing was not a daily ritual, it was an event, and so, most days, water never kissed their skin. Instead, servants scrubbed their mistresses with damp cloths dipped in lemon water or natron, a salt that dried skin and left it flaking, brittle like papyrus left in the desert wind. No soap existed, only coarse substitutions that removed little but comfort. The skin, beneath all the ointments and incantations, began to sour. It blistered in places where linen rubbed too tight, broke out in rash beneath the wigs, and turned raw where incense smoke could not reach. But complaints were forbidden. Illness in a queen could be interpreted as a curse, and curses were dangerous in a palace where gods walked in rumor and silence. So the wives of pharaohs learned to speak less, to sweat quietly, to endure their rotting glamour with royal poise. Their rooms, perfumed to the point of nausea, were not sanctuaries of health. The windows were narrow, designed to keep out spirits and spies alike. The air thickened quickly, curling around the burning incense, lingering long after it had faded. What seemed holy to visitors was, to the women within, a stale fog that trapped every odor their bodies tried to expel. Every breath they took was another inhalation of the previous one. Fresh air was a myth, written in hieroglyphs far from these walls. Even the fans that stirred the room were it not for cooling. They were symbols, long-handled ostrich plumes carried by eunuchs and slaves, who barely brushed air over their mistresses' sweating backs. These feathers, once pure, grew heavy with dust, their shafts greasy with the oil they swept from royal shoulders. Still, they waved, and the illusion remained, of comfort, of elegance, of sacredness. None dared say that what they felt was the stir of rot. Their wigs elaborate, adorned, and heavy were not merely accessories but burdens, made of human and animal hair bound with beeswax. They perched atop heads, shaved bald to control lice. But even baldness did not cure infestation. Lice hid in the very wigs meant to protect. When worn too long, the wax melted in the heat and dripped into ears and onto necks, mingling with sweat and oils to form a glue that bound both skin and shame. Removal was a ritual of pain. They scratched when no one was looking, not like commoners might scratch, but in practiced, subtle gestures beneath the gold collar, under the arm, behind the ear with the softest flick of a bejeweled finger. But their eyes betrayed them. Eyes rimmed in thick black coal that bled into sweat and caused irritation, infection, and even blindness. Still, they painted. For beauty was not a choice, it was a demand of the divine. The very makeup meant to protect their vision from sun and evil instead slowly stole it away. Minerals in the coal, when applied daily, worked their way into the ducts, blocking and burning. Some women wore eye patches in private, others accepted partial blindness as part of their devotion to beauty. They learned to walk the stone halls, by memory, counting steps, listening for the servants' sandals to echo direction. They never stumbled. That, too, would break the illusion. Perfume was their daily armor. Crushed flowers, heated oils, exotic resins, all combined in fragrant rituals. Yet none of it touched the filth beneath. It only cloaked the body in sweetness. When the oil soaked through, it attracted more dust. Dust clung to the skin like second skin, filling every pore, sealing in every ache. Sometimes they would itch, for hours, but no one scratched before others. Suffering, too, had to be elegant. And then there were the feet, supposedly kissed by servants, supposedly massaged with lavender oil, but often neglected, slipped into sandals gilded with gold leaf. The soles were rarely washed, calluses formed, fungal infections hid beneath painted nails. Even the servants, who washed them, did so with more reverence than attention, focused on symbolism rather than sanitation. The feet of a queen were sacred, but never clean. When they bled through childbirth, through miscarriages, through the cycle of the moon, it was not acknowledged openly. Linen cloths soaked in wine or honey were used as makeshift pads, tucked away and reused again and again. The maids washed them in the same basins used to clean the body. There was no separation between the sacred and the unsanitary. Everything was ritual, even when it led to rot. And rot did come, sometimes in silence, sometimes with fever. A queen would begin to smell differently. She would sweat more, her eyes would yellow, her gums would recede, but the perfume increased. Her servants applied thicker oils, her walls were burned with stronger incense. The odor was explained as divine transformation. Her sickness was veiled in myths, until it was no longer deniably, and then she vanished. She would not be buried immediately. Her body, wrapped too tightly in soaked linens, would begin to decay from within, but still, it would be painted, oiled, kissed, placed within a chamber filled with the same fragrances that had masked her suffering and life. The illusion followed her into death, like a final veil drawn over a lifetime of discomfort. Only the embalmers, working quietly, knew the truth. Her legacy, written on temple walls, showed her smiling, smelling flowers, anointing her body in gold. No one carved the rash on her neck, the infection beneath her arm, the louse bites across her scalp. That part of history never made it into hieroglyphs. She was immortalized not as she was, but as she was believed to be, sacred, beautiful, untouched by filth. But the truth rotted in silence, beneath the alabaster. And so the next queen repeated the rituals, repeated the lies. She painted her face with lead. She sealed her body in oil. She scented her blood and called it a blessing. Every brush, every bomb, every whisper of Kifi, these were not just rituals. They were acts of survival in a world that refused to see them as human. The gods had sculpted them, the scrolls said, but the gods had never touched their skin. They did not bathe to cleanse, but to obey. They did not perfume themselves to feel refreshed, but to disappear. Every scent they wore was another wall between who they were and what they were allowed to be. And as those walls closed in, their voices grew quiet, their footsteps softened, even their illnesses made no sound. That was the power of the light, taught them to rot without crying out. Sometimes, when a queen stood alone in her chamber, she would smell herself through the oils. Just briefly, the illusion would falter, just for a moment. Her hand would tremble as she reapplied the scent. Her eyes would harden, and she would whisper a prayer, not for healing, not for cleansing, but for the strength to endure the illusion another day. This was the palace of Egypt's divine women, not the paradise of perfumed elegance sung by poets, but a sanctum of silent, fragrant suffering, where the most sacred ritual was not anointment, but concealment, where every oil drop was a plea, every flower crushed a cry, and every breath drawn within those golden walls, a slow surrender to the lie they were forced to live. Their names lived on, carved deep into stone, but their scent, their true scent, vanished with them. Not even the gods remember how they smelled beneath the perfume, and perhaps that was the point. The lie was so complete, it outlasted the truth. Even in eternity, they are remembered not as women, but as fragrance. The air of the palace still lingers in legend, sweet, sacred, serene. But if one could smell beneath it just once, they might find the trace of something older, something human, something honest, and it would not be pleasant, but it would be real. The Nile, wide and shimmering beneath the desert sun, was once worshipped as divine, a river that bled blue veins through the baked skin of Egypt. But even the sacred can stagnate, even the gods can rot in their offerings. For though the river brought life, it also brought death in quiet, invisible ways. The water, pulled from its currents and poured into jugs, sat too long under the palace's breathless air, and the longer it sat, the more it changed, gathering taste, murk, the ghosts of unseen things. What flowed in with promise became, by nightfall, a vessel for sickness. The royal women, queens and consorts and cherished daughters, rarely touched the Nile directly. Their hands did not dip into its currents like the common women washing clothes or filling pots. Instead, water was brought to them in carved alabaster vessels or poured from bronze jars by trembling servants. But the distance between source and skin only widened the impurity. The river, once removed from motion, turned heavy, and what reached the palace, no longer living water, became water held captive, and it suffered. Bathing, in its purest form, was a luxury afforded not by status, but by access. The peasants, though poor, had the advantage of the river's immediacy. They could step into it, feel it move around them, wash away the heat and the dust. But royal women, cloistered in stone chambers and curtained sanctuaries, were separated. From this primal cleansing, their water was filtered not through stone, but through ritual, and ritual did not always clean. It performed, pretended. A queen did not strip and submerge. She did not pour buckets over herself as the slaves did. Her skin was dabbed, cloth by cloth, section by section. Natron water was the most used, grainy, salty, sacred, but it dried the flesh, stole its softness. It left the skin red and tight. To soothe it, perfumed oils were applied, which in turn trapped what had not been fully removed. Cleanliness was a loop without exit, a ritual that never truly ended, because it never truly worked. There were bathtubs in the palace, large hand-carved, often of limestone, but they were more symbols than solutions. Water was drawn for ceremonies, not hygiene. When a queen bathed, it was an event, attended by servants, watched by priestesses. And in those rare immersions, the water was never changed between women. The same basin welcomed different bodies. Each queen sat in what the last had left behind: sweat, oil, even blood, and no one spoke of it. In the corners of the bath chambers, where light dared not linger, mold grew in green patches, climbing up from the damp floors to the base of the walls. The fragrance of incense could not reach these spaces, nor could the illusions. The stone was cool beneath bare feet, but slippery. Sometimes a servant would fall, and if her fall broke a jar or left blood, the queen would leave in silence, her bath aborted. The water, now doubly defiled, was left to stagnate further until the next day. Drinking water was no better. Carried in heavy jars atop the backs of laborers, it reached the palace dust-choked and sun-warmed. The jars were not sealed, merely covered with papyrus or linen. Insects drowned silently within them. The linen was reused, rinsed, never boiled, and so the water, meant to sustain, became a slow poison. Stomach cramps and fevers were common among the royal women, but they were not blamed on water. They were blamed on spirits, on omens, on unseen enemies jealous of their beauty. Some royal women, more observant than the rest, began boiling their water, or letting it rest with copper coins in the bottom. An old remedy whispered by midwives. But even this could not cure the palace's air. Its stagnant corners, its damp linens, left too long unwashed. Purity was not just about what entered the body, it was also about what clung to it. And in the palace, everything clung. The basins, used for washing, were shared between feet, hands, faces. A servant might wash the queen's feet, and then use the same water to rinse her face, not out of cruelty, but ignorance, or haste. Water was not limitless. Even the river had its limits. Droughts came, canals cracked, and when that happened, the palace went into preservation mode. Bathing was suspended. Cloth replaced cleansing. Perfume replaced water. On some days, the queens would retreat to the coolness of inner chambers, their bodies sticky beneath their robes, unable to rinse, unwilling to change. Instead, they would lie on woven mats, while attendants fanned them, and other servants dabbed their skin with cloth soaked in rosewater. The rose masked the staleness, but it did not heal the rashes that spread beneath their arms, under their breasts, between their thighs. Those places remained hidden and hurting. Even childbirth, that raw and sacred ordeal, was touched by unclean water. The birthing stools were wiped down with damp rags. The blood was rinsed away with water pulled from basins used earlier in the day. Sometimes, infections set in by nightfall, and the next morning, incense burned in the chamber, not to honor the child, but to mask the stench of fever. And the queen would smile through her weakness, sip her coppery wine, and pretend her body was still whole. Some queens kept pet monkeys or cats, and these creatures drank from the same dishes, slept on the same linens, and left behind traces: hair, fleas, drool, The queens did not know that their own faces were washed with cloths left where the animals had rested. There was no concept of sterility, there was only habit. And habit, when repeated enough, becomes tradition, even if it breeds disease. Occasionally, a foreign wife gifted to the pharaoh from another land would arrive with strange customs. She would boil herbs in water, steam her face, or refuse to bathe communally. The Egyptian women laughed behind their hands, called her superstitious. But when her skin remained clear, her eyes bright, they began to wonder. Still, no one dared follow. To change custom was to challenge gods, and queens were not allowed rebellion, only endurance. The jars that held water for the queens were rarely scrubbed. They were too heavy, too delicate. Servants would rinse them and set them back on their shelves. Inside, a fine residue formed a lining of oil, dust, and whatever the water carried with it. Sometimes, the jar gave off a scent, faint sour. The queens noticed, but to complain was to shame the servant, and that, in turn, shamed the queen. So they drank, they bathed, they rinsed with what they were given. After years of this, a woman's body began to tell the truth that the palace tried to conceal. Her skin lost its glow, her gums swelled, her breath soured, her hair thinned. But these signs were painted over, plucked away, powdered down. Still, the changes deepened. Bones ached, wombs failed, and all the perfumes in Egypt could not hide the scent of slow decay. The women bore it in silence, their suffering sacred and secret in private. Some queens cried over their basins, not loud sobs, but quiet tremors, tears mixing with the water. As they tried to wash their faces, they did not always know why they wept. It was not just the pain or the illness. It was the knowledge deep and slow growing that nothing they touched was clean, not the air, not the linens, not even the river. And in that knowledge was a loneliness more biting than any fever-dotted times. A priest would be called to bless the water. He would chant over it, swirl herbs in it, place symbols carved from bone, and the queens would feel relief momentarily. But the herbs did not filter filth. The prayers did not kill parasites. And so, the faith settled in one place, while the truth swam silently beneath it. The water remained what it was, sacred in word, unclean in essence. The belief in purity was stronger than the experience of it. The queens had been raised to see water as divine, to treat it with reverence. To question its safety was to question Mat, the balance of the world. And so they drank what burned their throats, bathed in what dried their skin, and rinsed their mouths with what later caused sores. They bore it with poise, never blaming the water, only themselves for being unworthy of its gift. And when sickness finally overtook one of them, when the fever burned her clean of resistance, and her limbs stiffened beneath the linens, the others whispered that she had been taken by the gods, that the Nile had called her home, that her impurities had finally been washed away. But none asked what made her impure. None dared wonder if the water itself had betrayed her. So the rituals continued. The water was fetched, poured, and applied. Cloths were soaked and wrung. Wombs were rinsed, faces wiped. And still, the Nile whispered outside, wide and shining, pretending to be pure. The queens watched it from their high stone windows, unable to touch it, unable to know it. And the water flowed on, carrying with it the secrets of those it could not cleanse. The linen clung like a second skin, fine woven yet heavy with the weight of the desert's breath. What was once woven by temple maidens and blessed by priests became, by midday, a prison of damp threads. The queens of Egypt, wrapped in this sacred fabric, were said to wear the air of the gods, but their bodies beneath told another tale. Beneath the silk-soft layers, their skin suffocated. Trapped heat pooled in the hollows of backs, between thighs, under breasts, soaking through garments that were too pure in name to acknowledge the reality of sweat. The court whispered praises of elegance and restraint, of how the royal wives moved with such grace that not even the sun dared to make them glisten. But it was not grace that held their posture so still, it was discomfort. The silks soaked in scented oils held to the skin, unyielding, slick, every motion risked chafing. And so the queens became statues, glorious and immobile. Even laughter had to be gentle, even gestures had to be measured, lest the illusion ripple like water disturbed. The palace chambers did not welcome breeze. Their walls, thick with centuries of silence, absorbed heat and memory. Curtains of colored linen hung like veils between the women and the world, offering beauty but no breath. The air inside these sanctuaries was not stirred by wind, only by fans guided by tired arms. Servants moved in slow circles, waving air that had nowhere to escape. What passed for coolness was recycled, warmth, humid, stale, and always heavy. Each royal robe was embroidered with care, threads of lapis, carnelian, and gold woven into sacred symbols and floral patterns. But these threads, beautiful though they were, only added weight. In the hours before dawn, the garments felt light, fresh from perfumed chests, but by the time Ra crossed the sky's spine, they sagged with absorbed moisture. The women's backs grew damp, the fabric no longer swayed, it stuck, and still they could not remove it. Changing clothes too frequently was a sign of weakness. It required servants, basins, time, effort. It admitted that the body was fallible, that even queens perspired. So many chose to wear the same robe through the long day, hoping the scent of lotus oil would outlast the truth beneath. They shifted in their seats when no one looked, attempting to air themselves. They pinched the linen from their thighs too, create space. They endured. And then came the jewelry. Heavy collars pressed against necks already clammy. Bangles clinked against moist skin. Anklets left indents on swollen feet. The more regal the woman, the more she bore. The gold was not just adornment. It was a statement of divine favor. To remove it due to discomfort was to dishonor the gods. So they wore their faith like chains, beautiful and burning. Some women requested lighter linens, thinner robes, open sleeves, but these requests were met with disapproval. Modesty, tradition, and symbolism outweighed comfort. To expose one's arms, even in heat, was unbecoming of a wife of Pharaoh. To wear sheer cloth without layering was considered flirtation, and flirtation, when not directed at the ruler, was dangerous. So they dressed in suffocation. The inner thighs told stories no wall ever carved. Rashes bloomed in the heat, hidden beneath folds of fine cloth. The skin turned red, then raw, then blistered, and still they walked the halls. They offered polished smiles, nodded at priests, knelt before gods, all while knowing that every step might tear another layer of flesh. The servants saw it when they undressed them, but servants did not speak. They had learned silence long before. Speech, the armpits, always sealed beneath folds of fabric and layers of oil, became warm basins of infection. Without airflow or cleansing, the glands swelled. Some women developed lumps, some leaked pus, but they dared not complain. The physicians of the palace, more priest than healer, prescribed more oils, more incense, more silence. Pain was treated with perfume. Discomfort was swallowed with dignity. Their beds offered no relief. The linen sheets beneath them were fresh each morning, but by nightfall they too absorbed the residue of sweat and unspoken exhaustion. The pillows, stuffed with reeds or feathers, grew damp under royal heads. Dreams, if they came, were broken by the discomfort of flesh sticking to cloth. And yet, upon rising, they were praised for their beauty. They smiled through the weight of it. Some women began sleeping upright, seated against cushioned thrones rather than lying down. It allowed the sweat to drain downward, to avoid pooling in the lower back. This practice, though painful, became a hidden ritual. Upright sleep, minimal touch, minimal suffering. Even sleep had to be curated, controlled, withheld from the mist of the human body. The sweat was sweetened with pastes of myrrh and honey. These were applied in folds, under arms, behind knees. They masked the odor, but attracted insects. Flies found their way beneath the garments, crawling along the damp trails. The queens learned not to flinch. To slap a fly was undignified, so they endured. Even when the crawling woke them at night, even when the bites festered. Other insects followed: ants, drawn to the honey, beetles, to the oils. At night, the silks were hung beside the bed, and by morning they were sometimes dotted with tiny black specks, carapaces, eggs. Servants brushed them away, but the women remembered. Each time they dressed, they wondered what clung between the threads, what moved in silence against their skin. The younger queens suffered the most. Their bodies, still new to the heat, sweated more. Their skin reacted, their cheeks flushed, but they were taught quickly. Older wives and priestesses would instruct them in the art of stillness, of managing the flow, of shifting their weight imperceptibly. One did not blot one's brow like a market girl. One allowed sweat to trace its path like a blessing. Then, be quietly absorbed by the linen. During festivals, when the robes were layered and the gold doubled, the suffering grew acute. Public appearances demanded excess. The sun bore down as the queens stood beside Pharaoh, unmoving. Their thighs burned. Their underarms wept. Yet they held fans, offered blessings, and never faltered. To faint would be to admit failure. To fail, the gods, so they stood until the world spun, and were only removed when shadows fell across their eyes. Inside the harem, women whispered to one another of secret cloths imported, rare, breathable. Some claimed to own a piece. They said it cooled the body, that it drank sweat and exhaled air. But such cloth was never seen. It became a myth, a fantasy shared under heavy breath during warm nights, a cooling garment, like a lover that asked nothing but offered comfort. A dream. Physicians began creating salves to ease the chafing. These were made from crushed papyrus, goat fat, and herbs. They were applied in the evenings, before bed, and smelled faintly of decay. They stained the linens. They oozed when warm, but they eased the fire in the skin, and for that they were cherished, hidden in clay pots behind curtains, known only to the desperate. Once a year, when the Nile flooded, the palace cooled. The air grew damp, the wind stronger. The women breathed easier. Their garments stuck less. Their smiles came more naturally, but it was fleeting. As the waters receded, the heat returned, and the cycle began again. Dress, sweat, suffer, silence, always silenced on in moments of solitude. Some women, undressed entirely, stood before the lattice windows and allowed the night air to find them. These were stolen moments, forbidden, but in those moments they remembered they had skin, that they were not statues, not symbols, not queens but women, flesh, flawed, alive. Yet with dawn came the linen once more. The oil, the bangles, the weight, and the sweat returned to claim them. They donned their garments like masks, not just to fool others, but to survive themselves. Their suffering was sacred, and therefore invisible. They were taught that beauty required sacrifice, that the gods favored those who endured. The truth of their bodies was not carved into temple walls. No scribe etched tales of sweat or chafed skin beside the names of queens. Their suffering lived only in the fabric itself, soaked and sacred, and in that silence, the sweat of silks endured, as eternal and unseen as the desert wind that bore no mercy. The palace baths were not as heavenly as they were carved to seem. Though built with alabaster and guarded by sacred lions sculpted in stone, they held water that seldom moved. In the cool, shadowed rooms where the elite wives of Pharaoh were, meant to soak away impurity, the water sat still, thick with the perfumes of yesterdays. What appeared serene to outsiders, what poets described as holy nectar, was in truth a lukewarm basin of residue oils, sweat, hair, skin, and silence, all steeping together. To prepare the bath was a ritual. Servants brought clay pots of water, drawn from canals connected to the Nile. But by the time it reached the marble basins, it was far from clean. Silt floated lazily at the bottom. Bugs sometimes came with it, mosquito larvae, water beetles, once even a dead frog. But the wives said nothing. The water had been blessed. Questioning it was not just ingratitude, it was impiety, and so they submerged themselves, hoping the perfumes would mask the truth their skin already knew. Lotus oil was poured in abundance. Petals were scattered across the top to suggest beauty and divine favor. But these petals trapped oils and dust, forming a floral scum on the surface. As the queens and concubines sank in, the first contact of skin to water brought a slight recoil. It was not the temperature that startled them, it was the thickness. The bath did not cleanse, it clung. Their limbs emerged coated in a layer more fragrant than clean, and yet they smiled, pretending renewal. Each wife had her own designated hour, but the water was rarely replaced between visits. Only when a high priestess or the queen herself requested it was the basin emptied. Otherwise, the liquid was stirred, perfumed again, made to look new. The same water that soothed one woman's sores would envelop another's thighs within the hour. And in this way, the sacred and the putrid intertwined. After long days in silk and gold, the women yearned for coolness, for the rare touch of relief. They descended into the baths, not for cleanliness, but for escape. But once inside, they were met with floating hairs, the invisible slick of another's suffering. They moved slowly to avoid stirring the bottom, where darker things settled. What the eye could not see, the skin still felt the unseen touch of all who had come before. their skin began to change. For some, rashes bloomed along the collarbone and spine, small bumps that wept and dried in the shape of stars. For others, the folds beneath the breasts or knees became tender, then cracked. Still they bathed. The priests said it was a trial, that their beauty must be tested, that they were vessels of divine endurance, and so, to protest was shameful. Silence was the bomb. Insects began to notice. Tiny gnats circled the room, drawn to the layered scents. Some settled on the bathwater's edge, sipping from the stagnant perfume. Others clung to the folds of towels left nearby, or crawled across warm backs and damp ankles. Their presence became a second skin. They were not shooed away. To do so was unseemly. Instead, the women learned to let them feed, let them walk, let them bite. The marble walls of the bath chamber absorbed this routine. The scent, over time, changed. It was not just myrrh and lotus anymore, it was mold and time, decay wrapped in beauty. The servants whispered of gods who wept not for the dead, but for the living who bathed without truth. Yet still they brought the jugs, poured the water, arranged the flowers. The lie was too beautiful to end. Some women took to bathing in silence, their eyes closed, their mouths pressed into the stillness. They would lower themselves until only their noses remained above the surface. In that sensory prison, they imagined cool rivers, moving streams, something other than this stagnant ritual. But the scent would always return heavy, floral, false. Occasionally, a woman would fall ill. Fever, swelling, infections beneath the arms or between the legs. The palace healers would prescribe more oils, more bathing. The bath that had caused the ailment became its supposed cure. And so the cycle deepened, disease wrapped in devotion, and no one dared to question the water's holiness. One compagnon, barely a woman, once dared to ask for clean water. She said it softly, her voice trembling like the ripples she longed for. The priest overseeing the bath chamber did not strike her. He merely turned away, and she was never invited to bathe again. Within weeks, she was gone, her name scrubbed from the palace ledger. Cleanliness, it seemed, was dangerous. The basins themselves were never scrubbed. To touch the stone with bristle or vinegar was to mar the sacred space. Only linen cloths, soaked in rose oil, were allowed. They polished the rim, but never the bottom, and so the unseen film grew thick. Sometimes, during droughts, the bath would not be filled at all. Instead, women would sit in empty basins, pretending they poured perfumes on their shoulders and wept into the absence of water. The palace's upper chambers contained smaller private baths. Some said these were cleaner, but they were for the pharaoh's favored only. Most women were never allowed there. They bathed in the open baths, where the scent of shared suffering rose like incense. Even laughter was rare in those rooms. Sound carried too far, echoed too sharp, so the women bathed in silence, like mourners before the living tomb of ritual. When menstruation came, the baths were not abandoned. Instead, the women used special cloths and potions to purify themselves before entering. But blood was stubborn. It bled through fabric, it trailed into the water, and once again, the oils rose to hide it. The scent of iron joined that of lotus. No one spoke of it. It was simply another part of what made them sacred and silent. In the colder months, the water chilled, still not clean, still unmoving, but now sharp with cold. It shocked the body, caused the breath to catch. Some fainted, some emerged, shaking, teeth clattering like temple bells. But they were wrapped quickly in perfumed cloths and led to their chambers. This too, they were told, was purification. Suffering was a gateway to godliness. Even the attendants, though lowly, were affected. Their hands grew rough from the oils and the damp. Their backs ached from bending over the basins. But they too said nothing. To complain was to insult the sacred rites. Their lives depended on the illusion of peace, on the lie that this bath was a blessing and not a curse wrapped in luxury. The longer a woman stayed in the palace, the more her body changed to match its rituals. Skin that once gleamed now dulled. Eyes once bright grew weary. The bath, they said, was eternal. But eternity, it seemed, left rot beneath its surface. They soaked, not in cleanliness, but in the quiet acceptance of decay. And each day, they walked away still carrying what the water could not remove. A few women tried to resist. They bathed at night, alone, in secret cisterns beneath the palace. They fetched their own water from wells, but these attempts were dangerous. To be found washing like a servant was scandalous. One queen, caught at dawn with her hair wet and her robes undone, was publicly blessed, then privately beaten. Water was not a rite, it was rebellion. No scripture recorded the scent of that room. No poem described the filth beneath the perfume, but it lingered, soaked into walls and breath and bone. Generations passed through those baths, and each left something behind: skin, sorrow, memory, and the water held it all. By sunset the baths were quiet once more. The petals floated in stillness. The oils shimmered on the surface like the Nile, beneath the moon, and the next woman entered, unaware or unwilling to believe what floated just below. She smiled, breathed in the lie, and lowered herself into the illusion once again. The hair of a pharaoh's wife was never entirely her own. From the moment she was chosen to serve beauty in the name of the gods, her hair became a symbol, a burden, and a trap. Long before fingers ever brushed through it in affection, countless hands had already pulled, twisted, and disguised it to match an ideal no woman born could truly sustain. It was not washed with clean water, nor allowed the mercy of rest. It was wrapped in rituals, scorched by sun-brewed oils, and stifled beneath wigs heavy with ceremonial expectation. Each morning began with the combing. Servants chosen for their soft hands and silence would approach, carrying combs made of ivory, scented pastes in small alabaster jars, and cloths warmed under the brazier. The pharaoh's wives would sit still, sometimes for hours, as the tangles of sleep and sorrow were pulled away strand by strand. No word was spoken during these combings. The only sound was the rasp of teeth through knots, the sighs of discomfort when hair was pulled too hard, and the occasional drop of oil falling onto tired scalps. The oils used were revered but not kind. Extracts of castor bean, moringa, and animal fat were blended into pastes, thick and pungent. Applied daily, these concoctions made the hair shine like obsidian in the sunlight, but they suffocated the scalp. The pores could not breathe. Over time, sores would form at the roots. The women learned not to scratch. Scratching was unbecoming, and a bleeding scalp could not wear the golden headdresses of ceremony. Their real hair was never shown in public. It was hidden beneath elaborate wigs, some braided into intricate patterns meant to mimic the flowing lines of lotus petals. Others were thick, tiered in layers like temple steps. The wigs were not light, crafted with human hair, palm fibers, and beeswax. They weighed down on the skull like crowns of silence. Worn for hours, they left grooves in the skin, bruises along the temples, and sometimes permanent indentations. On days of feasts or visits to the temple, the wigs were scented with incense, frankincense, or cinnamon, and adorned with gold pins or tiny glass beads. But beneath the spectacle was pain. The heat trapped beneath the wig caused sweat to trickle down the scalp, collecting in the hairline. The sweat mixed with oil and dust, forming a paste that crusted in the creases of the neck and behind the ears. Servants wiped it away, but it always returned. Infections were common, but always whispered about. When a patch of hair fell out, it was not spoken of. When lice crept in, they were combed out quietly and burned. The wives dared not complain. To have flawed hair was to invite judgment, and to be judged in the pharaoh's palace was to risk being forgotten. So they endured each lock of hair carrying its own burden, each strand a record of silence. Washing, when it occurred, was a complicated ritual. The water was often laced with natron, the same substance used in embalming, mixed with herbal decoctions meant to cleanse both the hair and the soul. But natron burned. It dried the scalp, cracked the skin, left behind a tightness that only more oil could soothe. Still, the wives sat with their heads tilted, eyes closed, enduring the sting. Cleanliness, it was said, came through discomfort. Some women shaved their heads entirely, not by choice, but by necessity. When infections grew too deep, or when the hair thinned to nothing, the servants would come at night with knives. In silence, the hair was taken, and in silence, the woman was crowned with a heavier wig, one meant to distract rather than reveal. The palace artists painted these women as goddesses with endless braids. The reality beneath was far more fragile. The wigs themselves were rarely cleaned. They were too delicate, too sacred. Instead, they were perfumed, hung above incense burners, or soaked in scented oil before being dried in the sun. But the scent could not mask everything. Over time, they began to rot. The wax that held the strands together melted in the heat, loosening the weave. Mold grew where dampness lingered, and yet they were worn. Decay pressed against the skull, tradition outweighing reason. Children in the palace, young daughters of concubines and servants, learned early that to touch a pharaoh wife's wig was forbidden, but they watched. They saw the redness beneath the hairline, the tiny scabs hidden by powder. They saw how slowly the women moved, how they flinched when the wigs were removed at night, revealing raw skin beneath. Beauty, they learned, was not gentle. It demanded silence, even in suffering. Even sleep offered no freedom. The wigs were removed at night, but the hair was not left to breathe. Instead, it was wrapped tightly in cloths soaked in oil and resin. The cloths were wound like bandages, transforming the head into a silent tomb. This kept the hair from curling, from tangling, from revealing its natural texture. The women slept with aching scalps, dreaming of winds that never reached their skinned up. Sometimes, in the stillness of the inner garden, a woman would let her veil slip. In that brief moment, the wind would touch her hair. It was a moment of forbidden joy, brief, exhilarating, dangerous. If a guard or servant saw, the woman might be rebuked. If a priest saw, the punishment could be spiritual exile. But still, some took the risk. One moment of air against her real hair was worth the price of secrecy. The priests spoke often of divine hair. They told tales of goddesses whose locks were rivers of light, unsoiled by sweat or age. The wives were expected to emulate this, despite being made of flesh, not starlight. They could not sweat, could not itch, could not age. And so, as the years passed, their real hair thinned, turned brittle, and eventually disappeared altogether. Beneath the wigs and wrappings, there was grief. Grief for the hair that once danced in the wind, for the curls that once framed a girlhood smile, for the identity buried beneath false strands. Some women wept in silence as their last strands fell. The palace had no room for baldness unless it was holy, so they were hidden, and their heads were covered in gold. The concubines fared no better. Their wigs were cheaper, their oils less pure, their combs coarser. The infections came sooner, the pain was louder, but their suffering was less mourned. They were replaceable. Their hair was not the stuff of worship, merely another offering, and so their decay came faster and was more easily forgotten. Only once in her life might a wife be allowed to bathe with her hair uncovered under true running water. It happened during a secret rite in the desert, away from the palace, where the Nile whispered and the winds forgot names. There, she could walk into the river and let her hair float. No oils, no perfume, no bindings, just hair and water and breath. But it was rare. Many never knew such a moment. Even in death, the hair was prepared. The embalmer combed what remained, bound it in oils, and covered it with linen. The wigs were burned or passed down to others. The hair of a queen might live on atop the head of another, but her real hair, the hair she had grown and suffered for, turned to dust, soaked in resins that preserved form but erased texture. The scrolls would later speak of divine beauty, of perfect locks untouched by time, but those who lived it knew the truth. Hair was not freedom. It was a chain scented with lotus, a chain hidden beneath gold, a chain that tightened as the years passed, until the scalp could no longer feel, and the soul no longer remembered the wind. The wigs of the palace were not simply ornaments, they were declarations, relics of authority, woven illusions that turned mortal women into divine apparitions. Yet beneath their shimmering gold clasps and braided splendor, decay festered like a quiet curse. A pharaoh's wife did not wear hair to feel beautiful, she wore it to become a symbol, and symbols, once forged, were not allowed to break, even if they stank beneath their sanctified weight. Each wig was crafted with reverence, but not without pain. Hair was gathered from slaves, servants, prisoners, shorn without consent, boiled in oil, and braided tight with beeswax, sinew, and linen thread. The strands were dyed, smoked over incense, and rubbed with resin until they gleamed like polished obsidian. They were beauty molded through domination, art willed from agony. Each lock told the story of someone who would never wear it. Stored in cedarwood, chests carved with protective spells, these wigs waited in shadows between uses, but cedar was not enough to keep away rot in the damp heat of the palace. Moisture lingered like betrayal, seeping into the threads, softening the wax, and breeding the first whispers of mold. The women smelled it before they saw it as sweet. Rotting scent masked by too much perfume, the way grief is sometimes masked by laughter. When it was time to wear one, a servant young and silent would lift it from its shrine, Sometimes her hands trembled as loose strands slithered free. Sometimes flakes of wax fell like dandruff onto her linen dress. She would gently place the thing atop the wife's head, pressing it into place with combs and pins. If it fit wrong, if it pinched, if the smell was too thick, the wife said nothing. Dignity demanded silence, even when pain bloomed beneath the scalp. No one dared wash the wigs. Water would unravel the braids, melt the resin, and expose the truth. So they were smoked over frankincense and myrrh, again and again. But these holy scents mixed with sweat and mold, with oil and age, until the wigs no longer smelled divine, only dense like something that remembered the grave. And still, they were worn. For to appear without a wig was to appear unfinished, unfavored, forgotten. Some wives had 3 or 4 wigs, one for ceremonies, one for daily court appearances, one for offerings, and one for mourning. Yet each was used sparingly, for fear of wear. The ceremonial wigs were the heaviest, encrusted with lapis, coral, and hammered gold. Their weight turned posture into pain, left necks bruised, spines aching. But posture was beauty, and pain was invisible when masked by grace. Servants whispered that lice found refuge in these wigs, feasting on old sweat and resin. The wives never admitted it, but some scratched their scalps at night with sharp-tipped pins. Others whispered prayers as their scalps bled quietly beneath the woven coils. The gods, they hoped, would not smell the rot through the layers of perfume. The gods, they prayed, would be blind to suffering so long as it wore gold. Insects were sometimes found nestled in the wig, silver beetles drawn to the oils, ants dancing through the braids. They were brushed away with cloths soaked in vinegar and lotus water. But some remained, hidden deep within the wig's crown, nesting like secrets. One wife collapsed during a feast, and when her wig was lifted, a small black beetle scuttled free. She was replaced within a season. There was no repairing an old wig. When the wax melted and the strands loosened, it was returned to the artisan's men, who worked in silence under torchlight, replacing hair strand by strand, breathing life back into the dying relic. But the new hair was never quite the same. It clashed with the old, smelled different, and betrayed the illusion. The wife would notice, but she would never object. She had no choice but to accept the mask. Younger wives inherited the wigs of their predecessors. A wig that once graced the head of a favored queen now rested atop the brow of a forgotten concubine. The beauty remained, but the story changed. Wigs carried the scent of former lives, the memory of a woman's last ceremony, her final prayer. To wear a dead woman's wig was to absorb her ghost, to carry her judgment like a crown of thorns hidden beneath gold. Some wives secretly hated the wigs. In their dreams, they saw themselves bold and free, walking the riverbank with unbound hair, untouched by resin or rot. But waking came swiftly, and the dream dissolved beneath the demands of appearance. In the mirror-polished bronze, they saw not themselves, but the role they were forced to embody, a divine shell over decaying truth. Even during festivals, when the palace was flooded with garlands, dances, and laughter, the wigs remained. Flowers were pinned into them, jasmine, blue lotus, hibiscus, but their fragrance could not hide the musty core. Wives smiled as priests blessed them, their skulls aching beneath the weight. The beauty was convincing only from a distance. Up close, the truth clung like smoke. When a wife died, her wigs were buried with her. If she had been beloved, they were arranged around her head in the tomb, as if she might choose one in the afterlife. But if she fell from favor, her wigs were taken, cleaned as best they could be, and passed on. No one ever told the next wearer that she was adorning herself with a dead woman's memory, but she knew. They always knew. Some brave wives requested simpler wigs, lighter, shorter, less adorned, but these were seen as rebellious, unfeminine, or even dangerous. A woman without splendor was a woman without worth. The priests said beauty was holiness made visible, and the pharaoh's wives were the vessels. So simplicity was punished, and extravagance rotted slowly under its own weight. Artisans sometimes crafted wigs so large and intricate that the wives could not walk upright. They were seated on palanquins, lifted by slaves, paraded like statues. These wigs were monuments, not fashion. They turned women into icons, unreachable and hollow. When removed, they left bruises, bald patches, and red rings where pins had dug into flesh. But the bruises were hidden. The pain was never mentioned. Our children were taught early not to ask about their mothers' wigs. If they did, they were hushed. Wives didn't want their daughters to inherit the knowledge too soon. But eventually, the daughters would sit before the same mirror, their heads tilted forward as the first heavy wig was placed upon them. And then they would understand the silence. Even the Nile, eternal and flowing, could not cleanse the wigs. If dropped into the river, they floated strangely, bloated, waxy, ghost-like. Fishermen who found them never touched them. They believed such wigs carried curses, the unfinished thoughts of women trapped in golden coils. Better to leave them, drifting, half-sunk and weeping oil into the current. Some wives begged to be cremated, hoping the flames would devour the wigs that had ruled their lives. But the priests refused. The body must remain whole, they insisted. Hair must be preserved. And so the wigs were wrapped in linens, pressed to the decaying skull, and sealed in darkness splendor, rotting in sacred silence. Not all that glitters is sacred. Some gold hides the stink of time. Some wigs, beneath the braids and rubies, carried not divinity but quiet despair. In the heart of the palace, surrounded by incense and incense-burned prayers, women lived not as themselves, but as shadows of gods with resin in their hair and silence on their tongues. The line of kohl beneath the eye was more than just a flourish. It was a sacred gesture, a mask of both mystique and devotion. It whispered of Hathor and Isis, of magic ink that warded off evil spirits and protected against the glare of Ra. Women of the palace painted their eyes like prayers, believing that the blackened rim granted not only beauty, but survival. Yet behind the veil of ritual and reverence, something festered, something raw, wet, and unseen. The ingredients were no secret. Kohl was made from galena lead, sulfite pounded into fine powder and mixed with animal fat, oils, or water. Sometimes antimony was added, or soot scraped from oil lamps. What was once thought sacred shimmered in tiny particles of poison. Still, the pharaoh's wives dipped their reed applicators into it daily, pressing the heavy mixture against the delicate rims of their eyes. The morning ritual was sacred and unrelenting. A slave girl would approach with the cosmetic chest, her own eyes downcast, knowing that one wrong touch could provoke a slap or worse. She would kneel, pick up the slender stick, and smear the kohl beneath the eyelid with practiced grace. Sometimes the wife blinked, sometimes she wept, but she never stopped the process. The appearance had no room for pain. On the warm breath of the Egyptian morning, the kohl settled into the soft folds of skin. The wives blinked into mirrors of polished bronze, admiring the boldness of their gaze. The line made their eyes look larger, more divine. But in the hours that followed, the mixture began to bleed, seeping into tiny cracks in the skin, entering ducts that were never meant to hold metal. At first it caused only a faint itch, a little dryness, a mild sting when the wind was hot. The wives would dab their eyes with linen, adjust the kohl with a sharpened reed, and carry on. But the irritation grew. The lids swelled ever so slightly, and the tear ducts began to crust over in the corners. The discomfort became a whisper, then a murmur, then a pain they dared not voice. No one questioned the makeup. How could they? Kohl was protection. It had been used since the first dynasty. Priests wore it. Children wore it. Even the gods were painted with it in the tombs. The wives believed, because they had to believe, that discomfort was the price of holiness. It was not poison, it was discipline. It was beauty etched in suffering. But lead is never quiet in the body. The more it was applied, the more it was absorbed. Some wives began to lose vision in one eye, just slightly. Their depth perception wavered. They misstepped on palace stairs or tilted their heads strangely when looking at their children. At night, when candles were dimmed, the pain returned not from lack of light, but from the slow burn beneath the lashes. Festivals made it worse. For such occasions, more kohl was used, layered thick and sculpted into elaborate curves that mimicked falcon wings. The weight on the eyelids was physical, heavy with symbolism and actual grime. After hours of celebration and sweat, it clumped in the folds of skin, hardened near the tear ducts, and left smears across pillows like the trail of ink from a leaking pen. Healers offered remedies, but never solutions. Honey mixed with crushed lotus petals, onion juice and myrrh. Salves that burned. Nothing helped. The wives dared not stop using kohl. To do so would be to appear bare, vulnerable, imperfect, and so they lied, saying their eyes were red from prayer, not pain, that the tears were from gratitude, not rot. In time, some women could no longer open their eyes fully. The lids became heavy, swollen, and misshapen. The once graceful gaze was now perpetually half-lidded, not from allure, but from infection. The palace artists still painted them as radiant, untouched, divine. But behind closed doors, their servants knew the truth. They changed the linens stained with yellow pus. They applied salves to crusted corners in the dark. Some wives turned 2 charms amulets in the shape of the Eye of Horus, placed beneath pillows or tied to braided belts. They whispered prayers into bowls of milk before applying more coal, as if holiness could counteract the rot. But faith, when blind to fact, becomes another form of decay. By middle age, many had permanent scarring beneath the eyes. Their glances grew stiff. The skin darkened, not from makeup but from bruising beneath. Some began to lose lashes altogether, pulled out during cleaning or lost to the swelling of their infected follicles. The empty lash lines were then painted over, further irritating the flesh in a vicious, unseen cycle. The worst cases went blind, quietly, suddenly. One wife, favored, beautiful, envied, simply stopped recognizing faces. Her servants had to guide her with whispered cues. She smiled in the wrong directions, nodded at empty doorways. The coal was still applied daily, out of habit and desperation. But her eyes were glassy, motionless, fading. Rumors spread of black worms burrowing in. The sockets of coal turned cursed by jealous rivals. But the truth was simpler. Lead eats slowly. It eats without teeth, without sound. It eats through the eyes, into the blood, until all that remains is the mask. Even in death, the wives were painted with coal. Their sockets darkened for the gods. No one questioned it. Burial scrolls described them with divine vision, forever gazing toward Osiris. But their mummified skulls, when found centuries later, tell another tale, sealed by scarring, sockets pitted, traces of lead still clinging to desiccated bone. The past does not lie. It only waits to be seen. Coal, once the mark of elegance, had become a quiet plague. It was not questioned because it was beautiful, and what is beautiful must be good until it isn't. In the end, the women wore their ruin like a crown, black-rimmed and sacred. And though the rot was invisible to those who praised them, it lived beneath every blink, every smudge, every stroke of the reed. The women of the pharaoh's court were admired for their beauty-tall brows, smooth skin, and radiant smiles that lit up temple halls and harem gardens alike. They laughed in courtyards adorned with lotus flowers, their mouths shimmering with teeth polished to shine like pearl. And yet, beneath the illusion of grace and privilege, those very mouths hid something foul: decay, pain, and the slow collapse of what should have been the crown of elegance. Their diet betrayed them. Though grains and fruits were abundant, the bread that sustained even royalty was coarse and riddled with stone-ground grit. Every bite wore down the enamel of even the healthiest teeth. What began as slight sensitivity after meals turned into long-term erosion. Molars stripped of their smoothness, incisors chipped without warning. Yet the court still smiled. Sweet things too were no rarity. Dates, honey, and figs were plentiful in the palace kitchens. Sugars clung to the crevices between teeth, seeping into microscopic cracks left by sand-laced flour. Bacteria multiplied in the heat, feeding on remnants of feasts. Within weeks, rot began, imperceptible at first, then unmistakable. The breath of even the most elegant women soured, carrying the scent of unseen wounds. There were no toothbrushes in the palace, no antiseptic rinses or sterile floss. Instead, women chewed on twigs from the Salvadora plant or rubbed crushed herbs across their teeth, hoping for purity through nature. These efforts soothed temporarily, leaving mint and clove upon the tongue. But beneath the gums, infections brewed. The smell of decay did not care for rituals. Priest-physicians sometimes offered remedies, resins, poultices of onion and vinegar, even incantations, but their cures were more symbolic than effective. Toothaches were seen as divine punishment, a trial of the gods, not a preventable disease. And so the wives bore their pain in silence, hiding discomfort behind practiced poise and half-smiles. When the pain became too much to bear, teeth were extracted not cleanly, but with force. Servants or healers would grip the offending tooth with bronze tools or hardened cloth and wrench it out. The screams of noble women echoed behind drawn curtains. Some fainted, others bled for hours. Abscesses often followed, yet their smiles remained intact, or at least the illusion of them did. To replace what was lost, the court turned to artifice. False teeth carved from ivory or bone were sometimes inserted into gaps, held by linen bindings or pasted in place. With resins, gold wires were used in rare cases, fashioned by royal craftsmen, not for utility, but vanity. A woman's smile might gleam, but beneath that gleam was instability, rot, waiting to spread. Makeup helped mask the pain. Red ochre applied to the lips, distracted from swelling or bruising. Perfumed bombs masked the odor of decay. And so, the rot was painted over, decorated, elevated. Even as teeth loosened and gums pulled back, the women were praised for their elegance. No one questioned why the queen chewed only soft dates. No one dared suggest that her grin was false. Over time, infections spread beyond the mouth. The jawbone, weakened by years of neglect and poison from the gums, began to decay. Some women developed fevers, strange swellings beneath the ear, headaches that throbbed with each bite. These illnesses were blamed on spirits, cursed charms, or ancestral sins. The truth: bacterial invasion was unknown. Still, ceremonies went on, even with half a smile missing. The wives were expected to stand at the pharaoh's side, mouths painted, lips stiff. Laughter was forced, measured, shallow, each exhalation carefully controlled to hide the scent of death rising from within. It became a skill to smile with dignity while swallowing blood. The obsession with appearance reached grotesque heights. In some tombs, archaeologists discovered toothpicks made of gold, ceremonial rather than functional. It was not about care, but display. Hygiene became an aesthetic, not a practice. The suffering behind the scenes remained invisible to the worshippers who painted frescoes of joyous queens. Worse still, some women were buried with dental infections untreated. In their skulls today, archaeologists find abscesses so large they pierce the bone, silent, permanent testimony to years of pain. Yet, in their sarcophagi, they were adorned with lotus crowns, their smiles carefully painted on linen masks. In private, whispers circled. One concubine refused to eat in public after her tooth fell mid-meal. Another drank only through reeds to avoid showing her swollen jaw. Some used small ivory fans to cover their mouths while speaking. This was not coyness, this was shame. This was the quiet choreography of suffering. Despite all of this, the palace poets still sang of the wife's beauty. Her lips like wine, they wrote, her teeth like moonlit pearls. But those who painted such verses never kissed the mouths they praised, never tasted the copper temps of blood hidden behind pomegranate perfume. For the youngest wives, the rot came as a surprise. They entered the palace at 15, with perfect teeth, bright eyes, and laughter untainted by infection. By 25, some had lost molars, learned to speak without smiling too wide, and adopted the cautious, close-mouthed laugh of those hiding agony. Their youth faded beneath the weight of silent decay. The kitchens continued to grind grain between stone, continued to bake the bread that fed empires. Nothing changed. No queen dared request softer loaves, lest she seem fragile. No priest suggested banning dates. The system remained coarse, sweet, destructive, sustained by ceremony and denial. Even the statues lied, carved lips curved upward, eternal in their perfection. But the bones beneath them, once exhumed, told stories of disease, of rot that gnawed from within. These women were not just symbols of grace, they were victims of it. Grace demanded a price, and so, the golden smiles endured. They gleamed in the sun, dazzled diplomats, and calmed the gods. But behind that gilded facade, the teeth blackened, cracked, and fell away. No amount of gold could stop the rot once it took hold, and the women knew it every time they bit into a fig and winced.
The court women of ancient Egypt lived in silk-draped chambers that fluttered in the Nile breeze. But when the blood of womanhood arrived, no luxury could veil the raw discomfort beneath their garments. Beneath gold-threaded dresses and perfume-scented skin, there existed a secret, a monthly ritual veiled in silence, burdened with inconvenience and shame. In a world ruled by image, where every inch of the female form was expected to remain pristine, their most natural cycle became a curse both spiritual and social. Unlike the common village girl who crouched in straw-lined corners, royal wives had linen softened, perfumed, and folded into makeshift pads. These were not sewn into garments, but awkwardly tucked, bound, or layered, creating what some scribes vaguely referred to as masks for the red moon. Women walked stiffly, afraid of shifting the fabric, afraid of blood slipping through. Linen was expensive, and changing it too often was seen as wasteful, even in the palace. So many endured hours with stained layers beneath them, praying for silence from their bodies. Ash was another solution, collected from incense braziers or temple fires. It was believed to neutralize impurity. Mixed with oils and herbs, it was pressed into folds of linen and tied against the vulva. At first, the combination may have provided dryness or a placebo of purification, but soon the ash chafed, rubbed raw, invited infection. Still, they endured. Pain, after all, was quieter than disgrace. Servants were often tasked with disposing of soiled cloths, but no one spoke of the act. Bloodied linen was burned or buried, never simply discarded. To allow blood to linger was to risk spiritual pollution. Some women, afraid of being seen as unclean in the eyes of the gods, prayed daily during their cycle, bathing obsessively even when water was scarce. Their prayers were whispered while crouching over stone basins, tears mixing with crimson, offerings of incense curling in the air as if to carry their shame skyward. The pharaoh's wives could not rest during menstruation. Ceremonies continued. Dinners were attended. Smiles still painted their faces. Beneath jeweled belts and tight sashes, the linen shifted. Some bled through. And though the priests preached divine forgiveness for the blood of Eve, the palace still frowned at stains, both literal and symbolic. A woman who soiled a cushion might find herself reassigned to a lesser chamber or subject to purification rites. There was no such thing as a private moon in the palace. If a woman bled, her scent was noticeable. The body changed, its warmth increased, its chemistry whispered to other women. Rumors followed. Some wives were accused of exaggerating their cycles to avoid intimacy or ceremony. Others were suspected of hiding false cloths beneath their robes to excuse themselves from responsibilities. Menstruation became not just a bodily event, but a battlefield of suspicion and etiquette. Yet even amid these silent battles, creativity flourished. Some women embroidered tiny red symbols onto their linen masks, hidden talismans to ward off discomfort. Others carried tiny satchels of dried lavender or crushed lotus petals, hoping their fragrance would drown the metallic trace of blood. These rituals were passed from elder wives to younger ones in hushed lessons: how to walk without pressing too hard, how to cleanse linen with clay, how to hide a wince behind a practiced smile. But none of these remedies solved the central affliction. The heat. Egypt's summers were unforgiving. The combination of sweat, menstrual flow, ash, and fabric created an unbearable friction. Rashes bloomed. Some women itched until their thighs bled. Doctors offered salves made of honey, garlic, or animal fat, but none truly soothed the wounds. At night, many slept on stone floors rather than beds, hoping the cool surface would ease their fevered bodies. And still, the blood returned each month, sometimes gentle, sometimes angry. For some wives, it was a relief. It meant they had not yet been chosen to bear the pharaoh's child. For others, it was a curse, a failure of fertility. Midwives and priestesses read the flow like omens, too thin, too dark, too frequent, and drew conclusions about a woman's worth. In that red tide swirled fear, hope, and the weight of dynasties. Rarely, women died from complications. A tear became an infection, a fever turned into sepsis. These deaths were not spoken of openly. Instead, their tombs were sealed quietly. Their names were whispered with caution. The blood that had betrayed them was never painted on their tomb walls. No image of bleeding goddesses graced their sarcophagi. Instead, they were immortalized as virginal, pure, untouched by the most human of cycles. Worse still were the forced cleansings. In moments of panic, such as when a woman bled on temple steps or during a fertility rite, servants dragged her into baths and scrubbed her skin with rough cloths and sacred salts. Sometimes the skin broke. These punishments masqueraded as purification. A woman was never punished for bleeding, officially. She was simply restored to balance. But all knew what it meant when a queen emerged from the bathhouse shaking, her eyes rimmed with red. Other women simply hid. They learned to disappear during their cycle, faking illness, feigning spiritual trances, or locking themselves in their rooms under the excuse of dreams sent by Hathor. These withdrawals became part of their monthly ritual. Some even painted their faces ghost white during this time, signaling to other women without words, "Do not ask, let me bleed in peace." But peace was rare. The constant paranoia of leaking, of staining ceremonial robes, of being exposed during dance or prayer, haunted even the boldest women. Some packed extra linen between their legs during festivals, walking stiffly like soldiers in armor. Others sat on stone stools for hours to avoid pressure. The menstrual mask became both shield and shackle. Among servants, menstrual knowledge was richer, passed down freely, unburdened by shame. They made pads from papyrus reeds, moss, or wool. They did not fear blood. They washed and bled in open spaces, squatted beside streams, shared jokes about cramps. The palace women, watching from above, envied that ease. They had gold but not freedom. The priests never discussed menstruation in sermons. The scribes rarely recorded it. but deep in temple archives, clay tablets reveal coded remedies. When the moon flows with fire, or if the lotus reddens beneath the horizon, such euphemisms hint at an ancient embarrassment, a refusal to name what was natural, and so the mask grew heavier. By middle age, some women stopped bleeding altogether. They welcomed the end not with grief but relief. Finally, the silence could end. Finally, they could walk without fear. But even then, the memories remained, of nights spent burning bloody linen behind shrines, of days spent whispering apologies to gods for being born female. And still the cycle returned in others. The youngest wives entered the palace with fresh linen and nervous smiles. They too would learn the art of the mask, the sting of ash, the stiff walk of shame, and the elder wives would say nothing. They would only watch and remember. In the torchlit corridors of the pharaoh's palace, sensuality was not just an expectation, it was a performance. The wives and concubines of Egypt's elite were trained not only in language and music, but in the art of seduction, their every gesture a curated illusion of purity and desire. Yet beneath the layers of jasmine oil, ivory perfume flasks, and silky cloth lay a truth rarely whispered. Their intimacy was more masked than magic, their allure clinging to the edge of unclean truths. The very oils that glistened on their skin often masked bodies that had not been bathed properly in days. Though scented baths were celebrated in papyri and paintings, the reality was more selective. Water was precious, and not every chamber had access to it. Many women instead wiped themselves with linen dipped in oil or perfumed wine, rubbing it into the skin to replace bathing entirely. It gave the illusion of cleanliness, not the reality. Those chosen to share the bed of a high priest or the pharaoh himself were expected to appear untouched by sweat, dust, or discomfort, yet Egypt's climate had no mercy. Sweat pooled under breasts, beneath robes, between thighs. They smeared more oil to cover the scent. They powdered their bodies with crushed myrrh and amber resin, but the salt of their skin always returned. By night, their bedsheets clung to them with damp shame. Hair was another battlefield. Most noblewomen wore wigs, but beneath them, real hair tangled, itched, and rotted. They shaved or trimmed it only irregularly, and scalp infections were common. Before moments of intimacy, servants would hurriedly apply resin or fig paste to the roots to seal the odor. Still, the illusion faded quickly once fingers passed through the layers of woven hair and scented oils into the truth beneath. Clothing was part of the deceit, sheer linens designed to show the silhouette of the body, strategically soaked in rose oil to allure. But beneath those garments, few wore under layers. The heat discouraged it, and without regular bathing, the fabric collected everything: oils, blood, urine, dust, and the intimate scent of a body that had endured long hours of discomfort. Yet to remove the garment was to invite judgment. They were meant to be beautiful, even when filthy. Some women practiced intimate cleansing with honey and wine. This was thought to sweeten the body, to make it pleasing for their lords. The reality, however, was that it often disrupted natural balance, inviting irritation, swelling, or infection. But pain was the price of perception. Women inserted soaked linen, bark, or resin to absorb discharge and odor. They smiled through burning. The palace expected pleasure, not pain, and so love became theater. A woman knelt, draped in finery, perfumed to the heavens, but her breath held the dryness of unwashed teeth, her thighs chafed with dried salt, her mouth filled with rehearsed words. Seduction was a duty. If she refused, rumors would bloom. She has lost her favor, they would say. The gods no longer find her pleasing. That fear drove many to endure. During fertility rites, the illusion became ritual. Women danced naked but painted in perfumed clay, their bodies symbols of divine fecundity. The clay hid blemishes, masked sores, covered scars from childbirth. It was washed off only after hours, and sometimes it stuck so tightly that skin peeled. The smile never left their faces. Pain was part of the performance. Between encounters, many women avoided food or water, fearful of bloat or odor. Fasting made them weak, but weakness was hidden. They consumed small petals soaked in oil, believing it would scent their breath and skin from the inside. It did not. Instead, it often caused stomach issues, but again, the illusion mattered more than truth. Better a hollow belly than a foul scent. Even the beds were part of the lie. Piled with pillows, embroidered with doves and lotuses, they looked inviting. But beneath them, the linens often went unchanged for days. No servant dared remove them without permission, and if a woman bled or sweated through them, she covered the stain with another silk. The smell slowly became permanent, but the scent of lotus oil burned stronger. Infection became silent company. Small sores between legs were hidden with powder. Warts were painted with kohl. Swelling was disguised with tight cloth. They avoided doctors, for to admit sickness was to risk being cast out of favor. Instead, they brewed secret pastes from garlic and milk, applying them behind closed doors, praying the gods would spare them from shame. Men rarely noticed. Their expectations were clouded by wine and their own desire. A sweet breath, a soft moan, a gentle sway of the hips, this was enough. They never smelled beneath the oil. They never touched deep enough to find the rash. Their illusions remained intact, and the women protected that ignorance like treasure. If the illusion broke, it was she who paid the price. There were moments, however, when the mask slipped. A moan replaced by a wince, a turned face to hide a scent, a servant scolded for bringing the wrong oil. These breaches were remembered. A woman who faltered once might not be called again. She would retreat to quieter rooms, her perfume bottles drying in silence, her body no longer required to perform. That quiet could be both relief and exile. To remain favored, women created rituals. One wife chewed cloves constantly, staining her teeth but scenting her breath. Another lined her thighs with strips of cinnamon bark to hide the rawness from repeated use. These acts were painful, absurd, even dangerous. But they worked. The illusion survived another night, and that was enough. Among the older wives, stories were shared, of infections that spread to the womb, of fevers that followed a particularly rough night, of pregnancies lost due to poor hygiene. But these were whispered, passed in shaded corners or over sick beds. The younger women listened but could not change their paths. The palace demanded beauty. It punished truth. Even childbirth did not end the performance. Women were expected to be pleasing again within weeks. No rest, no softness. They dabbed oil on stitched wounds, hid their leaking breasts beneath padded cloth, and returned to the bedchambers. The illusion, after all, did not sleep. The show resumed, no matter the pain behind the curtain. Only in death did the illusion end. In their tombs, women were bathed, painted, wrapped in clean linen. The final intimacy prepared not for a pharaoh but the gods. For the first time, perhaps, they were washed with care, without expectation. Their bodies were no longer instruments of seduction, but sacred vessels. In death, they were finally pure. And yet the memory of their illusions lived on. In carvings, they appeared radiant. In hymns, they were divine. But beneath the stone smiles, we now know what was hidden: the sweat, the ash, the infections, the oils, and the desperate hope that no one would ever look too closely. Intimacy in ancient Egypt was never honest. It was survival wrapped in silk. The sacred oils of ancient Egypt were said to carry blessings from the gods themselves. Their scents, myrrh, frankincense, kyphi, lotus, cinnamon, and bitter almond, were believed to purify the body, elevate the soul, and mask all mortal impurities. In the chambers of Pharaoh's wives, these oils were not a luxury. They were a necessity, thick with ritual, mystery, and expectation. Yet behind their divine aroma festered an unseen rot, the silent burden of rot that clung to privilege, tradition, and illusion. The palace air was heavy with incense. Morning rites began with attendants smearing warmed oils onto every exposed limb, each touch a stroke of sacred devotion. But as the day wore on, the oils began to congeal. Dust from the desert clung to every slick surface. The fragrant sheen became a gritty film, soaking into pores and creases. Rather than cleanse, the oil locked the sweat and soil deep into the skin, festering unseen. Each wife, each concubine, each daughter of royalty, she bore a collection of bottles, some gifted by priests, others sent from far lands by caravans. But none questioned the oil's preparation. They were pressed, mixed, and aged in clay jars under the sun, sometimes for weeks. As a result, spoilage was common. Oils went rancid, especially in the heat, yet these were still used, out of duty, out of belief, out of fear of waste. Spoiled oil could still smell sweet if masked with enough resin. By midday, the perfume turned sour. What had once radiated divinity now clung to the underarms and thighs with the stench of fermentation. The women reapplied constantly. The layering made matters worse. Every touch added a new coat. Skin could no longer breathe, pores clogged, boils formed, but appearance came before comfort, and the reek was dismissed as earthy. The sacredness of the oil forbade its removal. Washing it off was seen as stripping the blessings of the gods, so women wore it until it wore them. Cloths stuck to their skin, jewelry embedded in the waxy buildup on their necks. And still the application continued, before meals, before sleep, before intimacy. The more one stank, the more one anointed. Some women tried to distill their own blends in private, boiling petals and herbs in their quarters. These amateur mixtures often lacked preservative resins. Mold formed quickly, yet desperation to maintain beauty led to risk. An oil laced with lavender might carry hidden fungus. One wife lost her sight after rubbing tainted salve into her temples to cure headaches. Still, others followed, hoping for a different outcome. The pressure to outscent rivals was relentless. Wives competed through smell. The stronger, more exotic, more spiritual one sent, the more likely one was to be summoned to the pharaoh's side. This created an arms race of olfactory excess. Some resorted to animal fats soaked in spice. These turned foul within hours, but their scent was memorable, and that mattered more than decency. Temple priests, too, recommended certain oils for fertility, for attraction, for dream-invoking sleep. Women rubbed these onto their thighs, their stomachs, even their genitals. They trusted the priests. They feared the consequences of disobedience, but no one warned them that these sacred mixtures often caused burning, infection, and inflammation. A sweet scent could come at the cost of weeks of silent pain. The servants who applied these oils suffered too. Their hands cracked from constant contact. Their lungs burned from inhaling heavy vapors. Some fainted during morning rituals. But the palace demanded perfection. If a woman smelled anything less than divine, the servant who dressed her might be flogged, and so the cycle continued, smearing rot beneath silk. In intimate moments, the oils created a thick veil between skin and skin. Lovers touched what felt like wax, not flesh. The scent overwhelmed, masking any real sensation. Women learned to fake pleasure beneath layers of myrrh and musk. They were vessels of fragrance, not desire. They groaned not from delight, but from aching backs and burning sores beneath the oil. Sleep brought little relief. The bedding absorbed everything, the sweat, the scent, the sacred oil. Night after night, linen hardened from buildup. Washing was rare. Old stiffened sheets scratched skin raw. Still, no one complained. To be fragrant was to be favored. To reject the oils was to reject the gods. Some women developed rituals to cope. They scraped themselves at night with carved bone tools, removing the thickest layers. They mixed vinegar with wine to dissolve the residue, but this brought wounds. These wounds festered beneath new coats of sacred oil by dawn. The cycle was never-ending. The body cried out, but the nose ruled the court. Pregnant women were bathed in oil for luck and blessing. Their bellies slicked with spikenard, their nipples glossed with honeyed balm, but infection often followed birth. The newborns, too, were oiled within hours. Some developed rashes, others suffocated from overanointing. Yet to question the ritual was to risk divine wrath. No one dared speak. At festivals, oil was poured over wigs and headdresses until it dripped down backs. The stench of 100 different perfumes mixed in the sun, turning the air thick with nausea. Flies gathered, bees followed, but smiles remained painted on. Women danced, their feet sliding on the oil-slick floors, their bodies coated in sweet decay. Older wives were particularly vulnerable. Their aging skin absorbed less. The oil pooled instead. Under breasts, between folds, in the creases of elbows, it sat festering, and still they applied more. They whispered prayers as they rubbed it in, praying for beauty, for youth, for survival in a palace that revered scent above all. The gods were invoked with oil at every temple, but those sacred substances were sometimes no different from what rotted in the wives' jars. The same mixture used to anoint statues was used in the bedchambers. And perhaps the statues in their stillness suffered less. The women had no such stillness. They lived with the slow corrosion of constant devotion. Only in illness did some escape the ritual. Fever burned off the oils, purged the scent, left them clean in pain. For a few days they rested, free of perfume. But as soon as health returned, so too did the vials, the jars, the resin-stained cloths. The stink resumed its reign. And when a woman died, she was coated again. Mummification began with oils, so much oil. Her body wrapped in linen soaked in the same substances that had corroded her in life. Her tomb would smell of frankincense for centuries. Visitors would marvel. She was divine, they would say. But she had reeked of sacred rot until her final breath. They were painted with henna and stained with ochre. They clicked gently against ivory amulets and combed absently through perfumed wigs. The fingernails of Egypt's royal women, wives of the pharaoh, daughters of high priests, concubines trained for nothing but allure, were symbols of refinement. Long, curved, and delicately maintained, they spoke of luxury, of leisure, of not having to lift a hand for labor. But beneath the amber-tinted shine lay dirt, infection, and the quiet bloom of rot. Fingernails became silent tombs of decay. In the great halls of the palace, grooming was both ritual and display. Women sat in a row like statues while servants clipped, filed, and painted their nails with fine reeds and sharpened flint. The color was everything. Red was vitality, black was mystery, pale orange was considered modest and sacred, but the instruments used were shared among many, wiped between uses with nothing more than linen and sometimes oil. Infection passed easily from finger to finger, from woman to woman. Beneath the paint, cracks formed. The sun dried the nails while the endless layers of resins hardened over them, making them brittle. They split easily, and when they did, the skin around them peeled, bled, festered. Some women chewed at their nails from nervousness or pain, reopening sores that never healed. Others had the tips of their fingers bound in cloth to hide the darkening, to mask the scent of pus that slowly developed under the layers. Fungus was the unseen queen. It dwelled in the space between skin and nail, thriving in the moist warmth created by constant oiling. The sacred unguents applied for scent also seeped into wounds, into tiny splits, feeding the mold that turned ivory nails yellow, then green, then black. Still, women smiled. Still, they tapped their fingers across obsidian bowls and golden mirrors, pretending nothing smelled foul. Manicures were performed with crude tools that carved more than they cleaned. Splinters of obsidian, sharpened bone, even dried reeds were used to scrape underneath the nail. These tools, though elegant in design, were never boiled, never cleansed in a way that would stop the slow invasion of bacteria. When infection flared, fingers swelled, but to show discomfort was weakness. Instead, rings were added, knuckles were wrapped, and the rot was hidden under more sacred oils. Women often dug into their own skin absent-mindedly. They scratched beneath wigs, itched rashes along their arms, pulled at bites from the ever-present flies. Their fingernails, long and never sterilized, were tools of torment. Each unconscious scratch opened the skin to whatever festered beneath the nail. Inflammation followed, but they masked it beneath perfumes and spices. The scent of rotting flesh, faint and acrid, was accepted as part of palace life. Some palace physicians attempted cures. They mixed vinegar with crushed garlic and lapis powder, applying it to infected fingers. But the cure burned. Nails often fell off entirely. Where once had been elegance, there was now raw, open pain. And yet the women returned to their painted rituals as soon as the wound closed. A bare nail was worse than an infected one. A bare nail was poverty. Fingernails were also status. The longer, the more curved, the more useless they were, the higher ones standing. It proved that the woman did not wash her own clothes, did not grind her own wheat, did not knead her own bread. It also meant that dirt accumulated in their undersides for days. Sand, sweat, bits of old makeup, and spoiled oils lodged beneath the curves, but no one spoke of this. They only admired the shine. During sacred rites, women were made to apply salves and oils to statues and altars using their fingers alone. The substances were sticky, full of unprocessed herbs, ashes, and dried animal fat. These stuck beneath the nails. Scraping them out later was near impossible, and many simply layered paint over whatever remained. Their fingers became vessels of hidden rot, smiling all the while. Some used golden thimbles or nail guards as protection, but these trapped moisture. Fungus thrived even more in the shadows of luxury. Beneath the cool gold, fingers blistered. Some women lost the tip of a finger altogether to infection. It was whispered about, never spoken of directly. She was cursed, others murmured. But it was not a curse, it was hygiene disguised as holiness. Young girls mimicked the older women. They dyed their nails before their first bleeding. They sharpened them into delicate points with bone knives. But their skin was soft and new, more prone to infection. Many developed fevers from a single torn cuticle. Some never recovered, yet no one forbade the practice. Tradition mattered more than safety. The pharaoh's wives had to be beautiful, even as they decayed. In times of grief, nails were torn out in mourning. But even this ritual, performed in public displays of sorrow, led to infections when the open beds of fingers were then painted again days later for court ceremonies. Tears mixed with blood, with paint, with rot. Grief became just another entry point for the unclean. Some women carried scent pouches under their sleeves, not for allure, but to mask the odor of their own fingers. They cupped their hands beneath their chin, fingers curled inward, and hoped the perfume would overpower the decay. In summer months, this rarely worked. The heat turned their hands into small furnaces of fermentation. In rare moments of solitude, a few scraped their fingers clean with salt and wine. They cried as they did it. It hurt, it bled, it stung. But the relief was fleeting. By morning, the servants would bring the paint again. By noon, the oils would be poured. By dusk, the decay would return beneath the colored sheen. The funerary masks of noblewomen included golden fingernails, molded to perfection, showing the world how beautiful their hands must have been. No one saw the blackened nails that had fallen off weeks before death. No one knew how many rings were worn only to hide the damage beneath. Fingernails scratched hieroglyphs into clay tablets. They traced spells across papyrus. They tickled lovers' chests and held goblets of wine. But through every gesture, every moment, they carried with them the unseen dirt of a world where sacredness meant silence, and silence meant infection. Even the embalming process could not hide the truth. Many mummified fingers crumbled at the touch. Their nails fell off inside the wrappings. Historians would find these one day and wonder if they had been removed ceremonially. They had not. They had simply rotted, just like the illusions they once upheld. And when a woman of the court reached for the pharaoh's cheek, when her hand brushed his robes, he did not flinch at the smell, at the sight, at the stain. He had grown used to it. They all had, in a palace of beauty, rot was the price of devotion. They hung from their hips like sacred charms, soft leather pouches embroidered with lotus threads, tucked beneath embroidered sashes or hidden in intricately folded linen layers. To the outsider, they were symbols of elegance and privilege, holding the finely ground powders and pigments that turned plain women into painted deities. But to those who bore them day and night, these cosmetic pouches were not only repositories of beauty, they were festering pockets of decay. Mold festered silently inside them, feeding on crushed petals and oils unseen but ever spreading. The women of the palace prized freshness, yet kept powders for years. Ochres, crushed malachite, and lapis lazuli pigments were mixed with fat, gum, or honey and stored inside wax-sealed containers when the ritual permitted. But more often than not, in moments of vanity or haste, the cosmetics were simply thrown back into cloth pouches. These pouches, often made from porous linen or treated goat hide, absorbed the oils and moisture from the ingredients, creating a perfect environment for slow, creeping mold. Each morning, women dipped their fingers into these bags, pressing powder onto their cheeks or kohl onto their lashes, never questioning the slight change in smell. The sweet rot of aged oils became familiar, almost comforting. No one noticed when the pigments began to clump, or when the powders, once vibrant, dulled and shifted to shades never intended. The mold that grew within left behind a greenish tinge, a fuzz barely visible in the shadows of early dawn, but no one dared throw such items away. Cosmetics were precious, often sacred. Servants tasked with refilling the bags did so with the same unwashed hands that prepared wine, bathed their mistresses, and fed the caged ibis in the courtyard. They licked their fingers to taste the quality of honey used in lip tint. They coughed into their palms before folding the bags shut. Cross-contamination was rampant, yet unspoken. The cosmetics passed between fingers, between women, between generations. Mold spread through proximity, skin to skin, pigment to brush, breath to powder. Over time, rashes bloomed, small red bumps beneath the eyes, dry patches on the cheeks, peeling lips. These signs were dismissed as sensitivities, signs of heat, of divine correction. Herbal poultices were applied, only to worsen the damage. The mold in the pouches crept into every pore, every scratch. Infection grew slowly and in silence, hidden beneath rouge and gloss. Some pigments fermented. Lip stains that were once scented with rose or cinnamon turned sour, biting the skin instead of soothing it. Still, they were applied again and again because a woman without color was a woman without presence. Pain was not a deterrent. A red lip that cracked and bled was still considered more noble than a bare one. In court, beauty trumped suffering. Palace artisans once tried to craft stone containers for the cosmetics, but the women insisted on cloth. Cloth was softer, quieter, more discreet, but the cloth pouches could not be cleaned. They absorbed every secretion, every drop of sweat or blood that touched them, and within the seams mold feasted. Even as the outside was embroidered with sacred beetles and winged goddesses, the insides teemed with invisible spores. Sometimes small worms hatched within the warm, moist depths of these bags. Crawling silently through clumps of paste and powder, they were only discovered when a clump shifted unexpectedly under a woman's nail. Such moments were met with silent horror. The pouches were not thrown away, they were burned ceremonially. But the replacements would soon suffer the same fate. The application tools, twigs, ivory spoons, soft brushes made from cheetah hair were stored inside the same pouches, nestled beside half-open jars and cracked vials. Once tainted, these tools spread the mold deeper into fresh powders. Women painted their faces with brushes already blackened by fungal bloom, unaware that they were inviting sickness to rest beneath their skin. In rare instances, infections swelled into boils. Some developed open sores around the eyes, mistaken for curses or punishment from a displeased deity. Priests were summoned, spells were recited. But the pouches remained, unexamined and untouched. The sacred could not be questioned, even if it was rotting in the palm of one's hand. Some palace women tried to dry their pouches in the sun, hanging them from window sills or leaving them near sacred fires. But the heat only activated the spores. When the pouches were reopened, a soft puff of mold-laced dust would rise, coating the nostrils and settling deep within the lungs. Coughs followed, wheezing. But no one connected the cosmetics to the sickness. Men, too, sometimes used the pouches. During ceremonies or rituals requiring divine appearance, priests painted their eyes with sacred black kohl. They borrowed from the same contaminated stock, and so infection spread between the sacred and profane, between beauty and illness, cloaked by tradition and ritual. No one dared name the source. In the tombs of noblewomen, pouches were often found sealed beside their sarcophagi, considered as essential as jewelry or clothing for the afterlife. When modern archaeologists opened these tombs, they found not fragrant powders, but dried mold, calcified and brittle. The scent of death was more literal than symbolic. These pouches, once filled with ambition and desire, had become little coffins of decay. The women were taught that beauty was not merely an adornment, but a divine duty. To be unpainted was to insult the gods, to defy the sacred role of femininity. And so, even when their eyes burned, even when their lips bled, even when fungus bloomed beneath their cheekbones, they painted, they smiled. They whispered spells of charm while their flesh decayed beneath pigment. At times, the mold spread to clothing. A pouch pressed too closely against a linen sash could leave a soft stain, a spreading ring that ate through the fabric. But such marks were dismissed, mistaken for oil or wine. Women adjusted their garments, fastened new pins, and wore the rot like another layer of perfume. When a concubine or queen fell from favor, her pouches were left untouched. No one dared destroy them, but no one reused them either. They sat in storerooms, forgotten, silently growing colonies of green and white, devouring their contents until only the shape of what had been remained. Sometimes slaves were sent to bury them discreetly. The longer a woman held her pouch, the more sacred it was believed to be. Sentiment clung to these items. A pigment applied during a first meeting with the pharaoh. A lip stain worn during a feast. These associations overrode hygiene. To cleanse them would be to wash away memory, and in a culture where legacy was everything, even mold was preferable to erasure. Whispers circulated about women who grew blind from tainted coal. It was said they saw the gods more clearly. But in truth, spores had entered their eyes, eaten through the delicate membranes. They wept tears of red and green. Still, their pouches were buried with honor, stained and sacred. And so the cosmetic pouch, soft, warm, perfumed, became the silent vessel of both allure and illness. It held a woman's beauty and her downfall. It painted her lips for kisses and her eyes for weeping. It outlasted her flesh, only to decay beside her in the dark, perfumed forever by the mold of forgotten vanity. The palace corridors carried with them the breath of flowers long since dead. The air, perfumed to the point of suffocation, clung to every surface, every skin, every strand of hair like an unseen veil. To those born into its sweetness, it was the scent of luxury, of divinity, of womanhood achieved. Yet beneath the sandalwood, beneath the rose oil, something else festered, something no amount of jasmine could mask. Disease wrapped in honey, sickness soaked in myrrh. It was the sweet scent of decay, and the women wore it like a crown. The body was seen as a vessel of the divine, especially for the royal women of the court. To maintain that vessel, to make it worthy of the gods' attention, the women lathered themselves daily in oils made from crushed herbs and rare saps. These oils, potent and sacred, were believed to keep the skin youthful and the spirit aligned. But in the heat of Egypt's unrelenting sun, oil became something else, a trap for sweat, for dust, for bacteria. It mixed with the body's excretions and sealed it all beneath a glossy sheen. Few ever bathed completely. The water in the palace was rationed and precious. Instead of cleansing, women reapplied layers of perfumed oil, each new coat locked in the residue of the day before. The neck, the armpits, the thighs, areas prone to sweat, were anointed again and again. The oil pooled into crevices and collected in folds, becoming rancid even as it shimmered. To others, it still smelled of lilies, but to the skin beneath, it was suffocating. The oils, especially those made with animal fat, did not age well. Left too long in their alabaster jars, they grew thick, darkened, sour. Still, they were used. Some women believed the stronger the scent, the more power it had. They mixed the older oils with fresh ones, ignoring the clumps or the color change. The result was a fragrance that masked rot, a sweetness that deceived even its wearer. They anointed themselves in sickness. And when a woman fell ill, when fever racked her body or boils rose on her skin, the remedy was always more scent. The priest said foul smells drove away spirits, and so the women drenched themselves further in cassia and cinnamon. The infection beneath the skin festered in silence, sealed in by devotion. The perfume spread through the chamber, thick and saccharine. Illness hid behind beauty. Visitors to the palace would marvel at the scent long before they saw the queen. They said her presence filled the room like incense before a statue of a god. But those who stood too close, who caught the undertones beneath the fragrance, sometimes turned away with unease. There was something there beneath the rose, a hint of old wounds, a memory of flesh turning against itself. The slaves who applied the oils knew the truth. They watched as sores opened beneath beaded necklaces, as rashes blossomed along painted shoulders. They saw skin peel beneath the pressure of massaging hands, but they said nothing. Their job was to maintain the illusion, not reveal the sickness hidden beneath. So they smiled, dipped their fingers in the sweet oil, and continued. The worst of it came in summer. The oils turned faster. The heat made them bubble slightly in their jars, releasing gases that stung the eyes. Some women developed strange discolorations on their backs and arms, dark patches that never faded. Others complained of an itch that no balm could soothe. But still they oiled, still they perfumed. To not do so was to dishonor the gods. Some concoctions used powdered flowers and fermented fruit, believed to invoke fertility and grace. But these mixtures fermented further once on the skin. By midday, the scent turned pungent, sticky, strange. Those who passed the women in the halls might pause, sensing something off, but they dared not speak it. To insult a royal woman's scent was to risk exile or worse. Even in death, the ritual did not end. The bodies of noble women were soaked in unguents before mummification. Their tombs reeked of sweetness, a perfume that clung for centuries. Archaeologists would later describe it as overripe, a scent that refused to die. They found jars sealed for millennia still holding the clotted remains of ancient oils. Inside them, fungus, bacteria, small creatures long dead. The perfume had become its own afterlife. Some oils caused burns. Frankincense mixed too heavily with myrrh created heat on the skin. Women with sensitive flesh blistered beneath the application but bore it with pride. Redness was mistaken for vibrancy, pain for power. The stronger the reaction, the more effective the potion was believed to be. They welcomed it. And then there were the perfumes worn around the waist, pellets of scented wax hidden beneath the folds of skirts. In the heat, these pellets melted. The oils soaked the undergarments, mixed with bodily fluids, and created a haven for bacteria. Infections followed, but were treated as divine cleansing. The wax was reapplied. The scent remained. The sandals worn by royal women were sometimes infused with scented oils. Each step released a puff of fragrance, but the feet, trapped in oil-soaked leather, rotted, toes cracked, nails blackened, and still they walked, still they smiled. Because fragrance was power, and power had to be displayed no matter the cost. The hair, too, was soaked. Wigs were laced with sweet resin and scented oils, but the real hair beneath was never cleaned. The oils trickled down the scalp, attracting flies, fleas, and worse. Some women shaved their heads entirely, not for ritual, but to escape the torment. Their wigs carried the scent for them, heavy and artificial. Court physicians tried to intervene. They warned of oils that thickened the blood or disrupted breath, but their voices were drowned in incense. Their words ignored. What mattered was appearance, was impression. To smell divine was to be divine. Sickness was a price worth paying. At religious ceremonies, women competed in scent. Layers upon layers of perfume were applied in preparation. By the time the procession began, the air was so thick with competing fragrances that many fainted. Some claimed to have visions, others vomited behind pillars, but all was seen as sacred. Mothers passed the same scented oils to daughters, never questioning their origins. Recipes were guarded like treasure, passed on like family secrets. The molds within the jars grew old alongside them, generation to generation, until the oils were more fungus than flour. But still they were applied, still they were worshipped. The reek of sacred oils was not just a smell, it was a veil, a shield, a prison. It covered the truth of decaying skin, of infected pores, of wounds never healed. It made the women appear flawless while their bodies cried beneath the weight of tradition. It was elegance and torment distilled into liquid, worshipped by all who dared breathe. And so, as the scent wafted through palace halls, through temples and tombs, it whispered its secrets only to those who dared to listen. The fragrance of goddesses, yes, but also the perfume of pain, the sweet, lingering scent of disease. The feet of royal women were never meant to touch the earth. From the moment they took their first steps, they were cradled in gold-threaded sandals, carried across alabaster floors, or lifted by slaves when dust threatened to stain their soles. In the eyes of the people, the queen's foot was sacred, a symbol of grace untouchable by common soil. And so they were forgotten, shielded, pampered, and hidden beneath layers of ritual and ornament until they became alien even to their owners. The sandals themselves were marvels of craftsmanship. Made from papyrus, palm fibers, or leather dyed with pomegranate bark, each pair was an offering in itself. Some had soles stitched with scenes of enemies trampled underfoot, a symbolic triumph. But while the outside gleamed with elegance, the inside grew dark. These shoes rarely fit well, especially after long ceremonies or extended temple processions, and the friction bred wounds that no one dared mention aloud. To prevent the queen's feet from appearing aged or cracked, servants applied oil each day. They mixed it with crushed herbs, soft clay, and occasionally with wax. The concoction, thick and fragrant, created a mask over the skin. At first it soothed, but as days passed, the unwashed layers hardened and trapped sweat and decay beneath them. The foot became something secretive, never fully revealed even to its keeper. Nail polish made from ochre and plant-based dyes added color to the royal toes. It was believed the deeper the red, the closer to the divine the woman stood, but the polish cracked under pressure. Beneath it, nails thickened and yellowed, softened by oil and then split by neglect. Fungal growths were common, especially in the hot months, yet still the polish was reapplied, masking infection with beauty. Royal feet rarely touched bare ground, but the sandals they wore offered little ventilation. With no air, no light, and daily oiling, the space between toes became a breeding ground. Blisters formed, burst, and healed in silence. No one dared call attention to them. Instead, slaves padded the insides of shoes with linen, hoping to absorb the sweat, but often causing more problems than they solved. Calluses grew unchecked. Where the leather straps bit into the heel or the arch, thick skin grew like armor. These hardened patches were seen as signs of strength by some courtiers, proof of devotion through endurance. Others whispered they were marks of the gods. In truth, they were the signs of slow suffering, of unnoticed pain endured under the veil of elegance. No ritual existed for washing the feet. Unlike hands or face, which were ritually cleansed, the feet were ignored unless there was a reason to display them. Even then, the cleaning was superficial, a dab of perfumed cloth, a dusting of scented powder. The deeper filth remained. Beneath the polish, behind the oils, the skin cracked, and beneath the cracks, infection crept in like a silent shadow. When infection spread too far, when fever set in or pus emerged from beneath the nails, it was considered a curse, not a medical issue but divine punishment. Priests were summoned instead of healers. Incense burned, prayers recited. But no one thought to air the feet or let them rest. They were shrouded in silk, hidden in gold, smothered in reverence. Shoes passed down through generations, worn not just for fashion but for tradition. A queen might walk in the same sandals her grandmother wore. The leather, brittle and lined with invisible cracks, carried not just memories but microbes. No amount of sandalwood rubbed into them could cleanse what lingered. And yet wearing them was seen as honor, even when they cut into skin like knives. When the queen sat on her throne, her posture was divine. Her back straight, arms poised, neck elongated. But beneath her robe, her feet cramped. Hours of stillness numbed them, and when she finally rose, pins and needles struck like scorpions. Yet she smiled, walked with grace, hiding the pain deep beneath ceremony and training. Bathing rituals ignored the feet. Basins were too shallow and time too brief. The legs were washed to the calf, but the feet remained beneath the water's edge, untouched. When the queen reclined, slaves fanned her face, oiled her hands, perfumed her hair, but no one touched her soles. They were sacred, yes, but also taboo. Too lowly to draw attention, too high to serve. There was no footwear for rest. Even in private, royal women wore sandals, slippers, or decorative foot coverings. Barefoot moments were rare and rushed, perhaps between outfit changes or in fleeting solitude. But those were the moments when the truth emerged. The flaking skin, the bleeding cracks. The swollen toes that bore the weight of divine responsibility. In temples, women danced barefoot before the gods, but these dancers were not queens. They were chosen for their agility and innocence. Their feet were fresh, unspoiled. The queen, watching from her incense-wrapped throne, knew her own feet could never move so freely. They had been confined too long. They had forgotten joy, forgotten rhythm, forgotten even how to breathe. When a royal woman aged, her feet bore the earliest signs. The skin around the ankles sagged. Veins bulged like lines etched by time, but no painter depicted such things. In murals, her feet remained forever delicate, forever untouched. A lie carved in stone, a story that erased the truth of her suffering. Sometimes, a trusted servant might be allowed to massage the queen's feet. This was seen as both an honor and a punishment. The servant saw what no one else did, the corns, the ulcers, the signs of decay, but she was never to speak of it. She massaged in silence, smoothing skin that had forgotten softness, whispering prayers only the feet could hear. The perfume applied to the soles was different, stronger, muskier. It mingled with the sweat and formed a distinct scent, one that clung to the sandals long after they were removed. Those who cleaned the shoes knew this scent intimately. To them, it was the smell of royalty. To others, it was something else, half divine, half decaying. During childbirth, the queen's feet were bound in linen soaked with wine and crushed flowers. It was meant to keep her grounded, connected to the earth. But the bindings restricted circulation. After hours of labor, her toes would swell, blacken at the tips. No one noticed. All eyes were on the child, on the future. Her feet, as always, were forgotten. Even in death, the royal feet were dressed for deception. The wrappings hid sores, missing nails, deformities. Priests painted the bandages with gold and placed tiny charms between the toes. When the sarcophagus was opened centuries later, archaeologists found shriveled remnants of royal feet, curled, cracked, dry. They marveled at the preservation, never guessing the pain they once carried. The murals lied. They showed smooth arches, slender ankles, perfect posture, but the truth was buried beneath papyrus, beneath oil, beneath duty. The royal foot was a pedestal and a prison, revered but ignored, worshipped but wounded. And in the silence of every step, it screamed. The private chambers of royal women were crafted for serenity, yet beneath the painted ceilings and alabaster lamps lingered an undercurrent of damp illness. These rooms were sanctuaries to the outside world, but often prisons to their inhabitants, where the air, thick with perfumes and whispers, masked a cycle of slow, fragrant suffocation. The sweet aroma was only the surface. Beneath it, a sickness brewed, not just of the body, but of space itself, where hygiene bowed to illusion. Perfumed burners never ceased. In corners and beside beds, cones of myrrh and kyphi burned night and day, masking bodily odors, menstrual scents, infected wounds. At first, these oils offered calm, but over time, they hung heavy in the drapery, soaked into linens, and clung to the walls like a fog. The air grew dense, warm, and unmoving. It was not fragrant anymore. It was fermented beauty, ripe and claustrophobic. Ventilation was a luxury often forgotten. The design of palatial rooms prioritized grandeur, not air. Windows were few and small, covered with linen or lattice. Breezes were rare guests, and when they came, they brought desert dust, not relief. Without circulation, every breath recycled exhalations, incense, and decay. Even the most sacred spaces carried the breath of yesterday. Beneath the cushions and behind tapestries, mold took root. It thrived in the hidden damp, the spilled water that soaked into woven mats, the wine that dried behind the bedposts, the oil that stained the cracks of wooden tables. Mold crept quietly, feeding on neglect, and yet it was never named aloud. Instead, servants dusted with petals, layered new linen, and ignored the spots spreading in the dark. When a royal woman fell ill, her chamber became both cradle and cage. She was not moved to another space, but confined where spirits could find her. Offerings were placed, songs whispered, and fumigations intensified. But the same room that was meant to heal also smothered. The air grew thicker. Trapped within the golden confines, sickness fermented in scent. Healers entered carrying oils and honey, sometimes garlic, sometimes incense meant to banish evil. They dabbed salves on her skin and lit more burners. The walls shimmered in haze. Her fevered breath warmed the sheets. Her sweat soaked the cushions. Still, the room remained a temple of illusion, with beauty preserved even while her body declined. Chamber pots were hidden in decorated boxes, their stench dulled with crushed lotus and thyme. But nothing truly hid the truth. In the hot months, the pots filled quickly, and their contents festered under lids of ivory and gold. Slaves emptied them too late. Flies knew before anyone. They buzzed around the carved corners, drawn to the rot masked by flowers. To disguise the scent of blood, be it from childbirth, miscarriage, or menstruation, servants filled pots with sand or ash. They sprinkled it beneath beds, inside folds of linen, over floor cracks. These efforts only delayed the inevitable. The sand absorbed, but also preserved. It held the scent of suffering and returned it with every barefoot step. Perfume bottles lined the vanity, etched glass, alabaster, obsidian jars. They held jasmine, myrrh, blue lotus, cinnamon, and frankincense. Each drop carried beauty and burden. Applied to the temples, neck, and between the thighs, these scents mixed with sweat and sorrow. Over time, they became cloying, indistinguishable from decay. In the corners of the room, behind the drapes, lay forgotten towels soaked in old oils, menstrual rags that had not yet been replaced, discarded bandages stiff with dried balm. These remnants hid in plain sight, trapped in sacred spaces where only the lowest slaves could look. Even they hesitated, fearing curses more than illness. Sacred animals brought into the chamber, cats, ibises, occasionally monkeys, left behind their own filth. The queen might adore her lap cat, but the litter box overflowed. Monkey droppings dried beneath the furniture. No one dared complain. Instead, incense was intensified. The problem was never addressed, only perfumed. At night, when the doors were closed and candles extinguished, the room breathed with its own life. The scents layered from the day hung like a second skin. The queen slept beneath mosquito nets drenched in oil. Her lungs inhaled beauty and bacteria in equal measure. Her dreams swam through that haze, always fragrant, always stale. Curtains soaked in oils never dried properly. They clung to themselves, sticky with time, with the breath of generations. When touched, they left behind residue on the fingertips. Their patterns, flowers, stars, sacred birds masked the slow bloom of mildew, but no one would remove them. They were gifts from the gods, or at least from favored artisans. Children born in these rooms often arrived crying, not from shock but from the stifling air. Their first breath tasted of rosewood and rot. Wet linens from childbirth were not always removed immediately. They stayed beneath the birthing stool, soaking the floor with a sacred, silent stain. When a queen recovered from illness, the room was never cleansed. There was no ritual for such a purge. Instead, it was blessed again, more oil spilled, more incense lit. The illness, once gone, was considered defeated, but its traces remained, embedded in every fiber, behind every carved falcon and woven lotus. Even love, when it occurred in the chamber, carried scent. The sweat of lovers mingled with the room's perfumes, turning the air humid and intimate. Afterward, the linens were folded but not always changed. Time piled scent upon scent. Love, too, became another layer in the room's bouquet of decay. Insects were common, gnats, fleas, and the occasional cockroach. The queen never saw them, slaves whisked them away. But the insects always returned, drawn to warmth and oil, to the sweetness of spoiled perfume, to bloodied rags and hidden chamber pots. They lived in silence, in the shadows, always near. When the queen died, her chamber was sealed. Not immediately, but after rituals. Spices were scattered, feathers waved, oils smeared along the doors. But the room remained heavy with her scent, her illness, her years, her sacred rot. It lingered for months, even after her body was moved. Those who entered afterward swore they could still smell her breath. Historians later marveled at these chambers. They saw elegance, artistic precision, the height of feminine power. But they did not inhale the air. They did not feel the layers on the walls or taste the heaviness in each breath. They admired the stone, not the sickness. Even the most sacred chambers decay. Gold peels, paint fades. And scent, though invisible, etches itself deeper than stone. The rooms of queens were never empty. Their breath remained, their sweat, their blood, their perfume. And in every inch of that sanctified wrought, the truth of their existence lingered, too sacred to be named, too strong to vanish. In the gilded silence of the royal chambers, the wives of pharaohs whispered across perfume-laden veils, voices barely rising above the hum of bees outside carved windows. But what passed between them wasn't only gossip or flattery. The women of court shared everything: jewelry, oils, linens, and in doing so, they also shared things unseen: bacteria, infections, slow sicknesses dressed in silk. Beneath layers of coal and gold, the courtly bonds became vessels for contagion, passed like gifts between powdered hands. The custom of sharing was born from trust and ritual. A favored comb passed from one lady to another during braiding was not merely a tool, but a token of sisterhood. Yet with each stroke through sweaty scalps, it gathered more than strands of hair. It carried lice, dandruff, and the beginnings of fungal sores. No cleansing water followed, no heat or sunlight. The comb, still elegant, moved on to the next head, brushing royalty and rot alike. Cosmetics were communal. Kohl, applied with reed applicators dipped into shared pots, passed from one eye to another. Some women suffered from red rims and pus-seeped lashes, but this was overlooked. Appearance was paramount. And so infection bloomed behind smoky eyeliner, silently moving from one delicate face to another like a ghost, immune to prayer or perfume. Perfume flasks were coveted. Shared between sisters, cousins, and even concubines, the unguents were poured onto the same palms, dabbed behind the same ears. Oils rich in flowers also carried the residue of sweat, blood, and dirt from previous touch. In summer, when the skin ran slick, this cocktail thickened and fermented on the skin, crafting layers of scent not even the desert wind could carry away. Shared sandals were symbols of affection, especially among younger women. A royal wife lending her sandals was an act of love. But inside these beautifully beaded soles lingered foot rot, cracked skin, and infections hidden beneath perfumed ointments. The warm interior of the sandal became a perfect harbor for fungi that found new flesh with each borrower. Linen wrappings used during menstrual bleeding were often borrowed when cloth was scarce. Washed, yes, but only in river water that bore its own invisible dangers. Traces remained: blood, discharge, dried skin. When wrapped again around another's body, it was a silent cycle of shared suffering, and none would speak of it. To speak of it would tarnish the illusion of cleanliness. The bathhouses offered moments of escape, but also facilitated this invisible exchange. Pools were not drained daily. Their warm, stagnant waters carried the sweat of dozens. In this blend of luxury and neglect, the women sat side by side, oils slicking the surface, their skin absorbing the same toxins, their wounds meeting the same water. Sponges, used to cleanse delicate parts, were communal. Stored in jars soaked in rosewater or vinegar, they were considered purified. Yet once pressed to the skin, especially to intimate folds, they absorbed all. When returned to the jar, they introduced what they had taken. Then the next hand reached in, the next body trusted the tool, and so the exchange continued. Lice spread like wildfire. In a palace where elaborate wigs and braids moved from one hand to another, parasites found no barriers. Servants were often blamed when infestations grew rampant, but it was the royal women themselves who shared brushes, pillows, and hours of close whispers on woven mats. Their closeness became both their bond and their burden. Jewelry, earrings in particular, posed unseen threats. Pierced ears, often inflamed or infected, welcomed new bacteria when another's earring was tried on. Tiny crusts of dried pus or blood remained unnoticed in gold loops. The wealth glittered. The rot hid behind it, and yet beauty remained the priority. Healing balms were another vessel. Passed from one jar to many hands, the ointments treated boils, rashes, and cracked skin. But double-dipping fingers meant that wounds from one woman contaminated the salve for another. The result was often worsening symptoms blamed on spirits or curses, never on poor hygiene or communal habits. Sleeping arrangements, too, contributed to this silent exchange. During festivals or morning rituals, women sometimes slept together on shared mats. Skin touched skin, breath mingled in the dark. Parasites, skin conditions, even respiratory infections moved easily in the still air. In these moments of vulnerability, what was most intimate became most dangerous. Fans, shared during ceremonies, moved more than air. Handed between sweating palms, waved before painted faces, they carried skin flakes, oils, and germs. Some even wiped lips or noses with the fan's edge during heat exhaustion. That same edge later brushed another's cheek, another's brow, without thought or worry. Even tears were shared. During funerals, grief drew the women together, cheek to cheek. Tears, mucus, and sobs exchanged freely, touching fabrics and flesh alike. The intimacy of mourning opened pores and softened immunity. Many women fell sick not long after such ceremonies, but it was called emotional weakness, never microbial exposure. Bedding washed in shared tubs absorbed oils from many bodies. Though fragrant herbs were added, the linen still bore the imprint of every back, thigh, and hip that had lain upon it. When a new woman used it, she carried with her the warmth and the bacteria of all who came before. Body powders meant to absorb sweat were often stored in communal bowls. Women dipped puffed cloths into the same mixture, then patted it beneath their breasts, between their legs, along their necks. The powder clung to moisture and heat, creating a perfect blend for yeast to grow, then travel with the next dip of the cloth. The sharing of animals compounded the issue. Cats and monkeys, beloved in the palace, moved between women's laps. These pets carried fleas, sometimes even transmitted ringworm. Still, they were kissed, fed by hand, tucked into beds. Their affection masked their role as tiny messengers of disease. Sacred rituals required the passing of amulets and sacred items from one woman to the next. These were held tightly, pressed to skin, kissed. When one fell ill, the same amulet was passed to another for protection, ironically spreading the same affliction it was meant to ward off. Magic was trusted more than reason. A favored lotion might be shared among friends. But what was rarely understood was how the open jar, left exposed to heat and fingers, became a petri dish. Mold, unseen but present, grew beneath the surface. The creamy texture felt soothing. The unseen spores did their work in silence. The belief in purity was tied to ritual, not science. Washing hands in scented water was seen as holy, but it rarely removed what it needed to. Hands moved from one body to another during birth, during grooming, during comfort, without a pause for actual cleansing. Intimacy in its many forms went hand in hand with contamination. Finally, the greatest irony of all. In their quest to bond, to beautify, to belong, these women unintentionally wove a web of sickness amongst themselves. They loved deeply, trusted freely, and shared openly. But in those very gestures lay the seeds of their invisible undoing, illness wrapped in elegance, passed along in silence, sealed with affection. They came draped in linen and conviction, these temple healers, their fingers stained with crushed herbs and soot, their minds bound by ancient chants rather than proven cures. To the wives of the pharaoh, their presence was both a comfort and a performance, symbols of care rather than vessels of true relief. Their healing was faith-based, wrapped in oils and spells, not observation nor cleanliness. In the dim light of incense-choked chambers, ailments grew while the illusion of care deepened. When a royal woman complained of a sore that refused to close, the healer reached for honey thickened with ash. He smeared it onto flesh with unwashed fingers, believing in the mixture's divine properties more than the risk he carried. But in the folds of his fingertips lived bacteria from the last woman he touched, and before the honey could soothe, the wound worsened. The rot was not seen as medical failure, but as a sign of spiritual imbalance. Most healers saw disease as divine punishment or energetic misalignment. The gods, they claimed, sent boils, fevers, and coughs as signs of disapproval. They rarely suspected shared linens, reused ointments, or infected touch. Instead, they offered amulets, potions, and whispered prayers. Each failed cure was met with a stronger charm, each infection a deeper plea to unseen forces. Their hands moved with confidence, but their knowledge had not grown in centuries. Women would sit silently as these men poured crushed blue lotus into drinks, swearing its euphoric properties would lift the body's gloom. And perhaps it did for a moment. The pain dulled, the senses blurred, but the underlying infection remained. Beneath golden jewelry and braided hair, abscesses festered, their sweetness masked by perfume, their heat hidden by lies. The healer left, unaware he had helped nothing but the illusion. Bloodletting was common. If a wife grew pale, she was said to have too much heat or spiritual congestion. A small incision was made behind the ear or on the ankle. The blade was used again and again, rinsed in water that shimmered with dust. Germs were not imagined, only the balance of elements within. The very tool that bled one queen would, hours later, bleed her sister, carrying with it invisible sicknesses that would bloom in the days that followed. For infections of the mouth, a common affliction due to honeyed dates and sweet beer, healers offered salt crystals rubbed into the gums. The same handful of salt, used again and again, traveled from mouth to mouth in royal chambers. It seemed cleansing, it stung like healing, but it was the carrier of disease. Their smiles glimmered with gold, but beneath the gumline, teeth loosened, pus pooled, and no sacred remedy could stop what had already begun. Skin conditions were masked with ochre and oils. The The healer would crush red clay and mix it with crocodile fat, rubbing it across the afflicted skin as if color could deceive infection. Some women believed it. They saw redness as strength, as divine femininity. Underneath, however, the skin wept. The mixture trapped heat, fed bacteria, and transformed minor rashes into ulcers that no prayer could quiet. When a royal wife experienced pain in her womb, the diagnosis was always spiritual possession or imbalance. Smoke from myrrh was waved between her legs, while sacred chants echoed off alabaster walls. The healer would never suspect untreated infections, poor menstrual hygiene, or repeated contamination. She might grow feverish, delirious, and eventually barren, but it was seen as fate, not preventable failure. No tools were truly sterile. Metal implements for lancing, tweezers for splinters, curved hooks for plucking pests from skin, they were wiped, not cleaned, dipped in wine or vinegar at best, left in woven baskets at worst. Each reuse was a gamble, each contact a chance for deeper infection, but the air smelled of lotus and frankincense, and so the illusion of safety remained intact. The treatments for hair loss and ever-present worry among women who wore heavy wigs were based on superstition. Healers recommended goose fat, mashed dates, and ground amulets pressed into the scalp. Sometimes even dung was used, mixed with herbs and hope. The application stank, the scalp festered, and yet it continued. They would rather endure the smell and sores than lose their place in the hierarchy of beauty. Blindness, often caused by repeated coal contamination or untreated conjunctivitis, was explained as a divine test. The healers would trace lines of powder around the eyes, whispering hymns to Hathor. Sometimes they offered crushed pearls or milk as drops. These did nothing. Women went blind slowly, subtly, as though slipping behind a curtain. No one blamed the healer. The gods had willed it. Healers often worked on multiple women in a day without washing. Their robes swept the floors of temples. Their hands adjusted bandages, rubbed oils, applied leeches, and wrote on papyrus without pause. Each gesture was an echo of ritual, not sanitation. Their confidence was a shield, but behind it lay ignorance, generational, institutional, sacred. And so infection grew quietly, nestled within faith. One healer was famed for curing spirit boils with a hot bronze coin. He pressed the coin to the boil until the skin sizzled, believing pain was proof of the curse leaving the body. The wives screamed, scarred, and bled. Some recovered, some worsened, some died, but the ritual continued. The burn masked the infection for days, tricking both healer and healed. When the rot returned, deeper and more furious, it was deemed fate. The diagnosis of bad air or evil breeze was applied liberally. If a woman fainted, if her breath stank, if her stomach ached, the air was blamed. Incense burned in thick clouds, fanning illness back into the lungs of the ailing. Windows were shut, airflow blocked, sacred smokes trapped the sick in their rooms. And so they coughed more, choked more, worsened within rooms meant for healing. Healers believed in balance, not cleanliness. Too much cold. Apply heated stones. Too much dry, rub on river mud. There was no concept of bacterial infection, only energetic imbalance. So they balanced and balanced while wounds turned black and flesh peeled. But because they prayed as they worked, their conscience remained clean, even if their hands were not. For intimate diseases, discharge, sores, or swelling, the healer would smear goat milk mixed with honey. If the symptoms grew worse, the woman was thought to be morally impure. She might be ritually cleansed, but not medically treated. Her pain was not private, it became a social stain. And the healer, unknowing and unchallenged, moved on to the next body, the next secret. Sometimes the healer was a woman, trained in midwifery, old remedies, or sacred rites. But even then, knowledge was passed orally, wrapped in belief rather than tested wisdom. These women carried pride and tradition, but not the tools to prevent cross-infection. Their strength lay in touch, in presence. But presence alone could not halt fever, nor cure a rotting wound. At childbirth, the royal wives depended entirely on such healers. If labor turned dangerous, nothing could be done but chant, press oils, and hope. Instruments for cutting or pulling were few and rarely clean. Blood soaked the mats, flies circled the afterbirth, and yet no one imagined another way. If the mother or child died, it was the gods who decided, not the limits of practice. Royal women trusted these healers implicitly. Their words were law, their hands sacred. But in truth, these healers walked blindly through corridors of disease, offering herbs where surgery was needed, charms where cleaning was urgent. Their devotion was genuine, their damage profound, and still they were summoned daily. Even when a woman grew visibly worse under a healer's care, flesh darkening, breath souring, consciousness fading, she was never abandoned. More rituals were layered on, more potions poured. They believed they were saving her soul, if not her body. Death was not failure, it was simply the final ritual. The wives of the pharaoh did not blame them, they had no alternatives. Their gold bought incense, not insight. And so, in the dimmed corners of palaces and temples, the healers kept working, tending, chanting, smearing, while infection bloomed behind silks and smiles. The help they offered was not healing. It was tradition, and tradition, once entrenched, refuses to see its own rot. The silks that adorned the royal wives shimmered in lamplight, draping their bodies like divine blessings bestowed by Hathor herself. They rustled like whispers in dark corridors and clung to fevered skin with the tenderness of lovers. These linens, dyed in rare colors and perfumed with sacred oils, were meant to elevate mortal women to celestial figures, but they held within their folds the silent breath of decay. For even beauty in its most opulent form could smother life when touched by ignorance. Every morning, maids would unwrap old cloths from bodies still glistening with last night's sweat. These same cloths, barely aired and rarely washed with more than scented water, would be folded and stored beside perfumes. Cleanliness was symbolic, linen was renewed by the chant of words, not the cleansing power of boiling water. Oils were poured with devotion, not understanding, into skin already harboring invisible wounds. Under silk, infections whispered. The oils themselves, pressed from lotus, myrrh, and cedarwood, were considered sacred. They were stored in alabaster vials and sealed with wax, opened only in ritualistic care. But in the humidity of stone walls and human heat, these oils spoiled quickly. Their scent masked their rancidity. As they thickened, they trapped bacteria against skin, seeping into pores and cuts with divine fragrance and deadly consequence. What was meant to soothe often sealed doom. Royal wives rarely walked in sunlight. Their skin, prized pale, was constantly shrouded. The layers of fabric retained heat and moisture, turning the body into a slow oven of infection. Beneath the silks, boils formed unnoticed, their pain dulled by perfume and ceremony. When finally discovered, they were lanced with bronze blades dulled by reuse. And again, silk wrapped the wound, beautiful and breathless. Death did not come quickly. It came with subtle betrayals, the sore that wouldn't close, the fever that stayed even after incense, the dull ache beneath the breast that no prayer could soothe. The physicians blamed curses, evil winds, jealous spirits. Never did they suspect that the sacred garb, the holy balm, and the perfumed oils were feeding rot like wine to a parched mouth. Death was blamed on the gods, not the gowns. Silk was a rarity, imported from the Far East through a chain of sweaty palms. By the time it reached the palace, it had passed through merchants, priests, and handlers, each one leaving behind their touch, their breath, their invisible spores. Yet the cloth was never boiled. To do so would be to ruin its beauty. So it was shaken, perhaps perfumed again, and draped upon the shoulders of a queen. In its threads, death lay dormant. One princess developed a rash beneath her breasts, an itch at first, then a burn. Her attendants applied more oils, more silk. She could not sleep from the sting, so they brought lotus wine. She drifted into foggy dreams as the infection deepened. The next day, her skin opened like overripe fruit. The priests blamed her recent behavior. The silk was never questioned. Silks were layered during menstruation, believed to hold in the sacred essence and prevent exposure to bad spirits. They acted like a second skin, sticking to the thighs, capturing heat and blood and secretions with nowhere to go. Infections grew quickly in that trapped warmth, but modesty demanded silence. A royal wife would suffer in stillness before admitting any discomfort. Death wore a smile and a crown. Even in sickness, the wives were expected to look divine. When fever drained their color, pigments were applied. When their breath soured from infection, cinnamon oil was dabbed onto the tongue. They were buried in the same silks that suffocated them in life, wrapped tightly, perfumed richly, kissed on the forehead with hands that unknowingly passed disease from one corpse to another. Even in death, presentation mattered more than cause. The oils used to prepare bodies for burial were often the same as those used in daily anointing, but during mummification, the oils had purpose, preservation. In life, their use was decorative, excessive, blind. Their thick coat sealed skin like lacquer, preventing it from breathing, clogging wounds, nurturing decay beneath a fragrant crust. The women glowed like gods and died like lambs. Attendants feared disobeying ritual. They saw every step as sacred, every oil and wrap as divine instruction. Even when sores festered beneath linens, they continued their duties with trembling reverence. If a woman's skin broke into black streaks, it was seen as divine judgment. The same oils would be reapplied. No mind was paid to the way the rot smelled through the scent of myrrh. Sometimes the wives would bathe before being dressed. But the water was rarely fresh. Pools were shared, warm and shallow, filled with floating rose petals that hid filth. One bather's wound would infect the water, and thus the next woman's skin. And when they rose, dripping with unseen danger, they were dried not with fire-cleansed linen, but reused cloths scented with oils that masked all but death. Worse still, cloths were reused between women of different ranks. A high priestess's old robe might be handed to a lesser wife after a symbolic wash. Though the rank may have lowered, the bacteria did not. Sacred oils, thick with resins, preserved not life but pathogens. The scent lingered even as skin peeled. Some wives sensed it. They begged to wear less, to be left in the breeze of shaded courtyards to avoid oils when sick, but refusal was rebellion. A wife who did not anoint herself was accused of rejecting the gods. Her status diminished, so she allowed the layers to wrap her like a coffin, silken, fragrant, and fatal. A favorite wife once collapsed during a festival. Her face, painted and powdered, hid the pallor of infection. Her skin beneath her robe was mottled. Her last words were mistaken for a hymn. As she was carried away, the crowd praised her beauty, her devotion, her grace. No one questioned the silk that clung wet to her dying body. When physicians arrived, they anointed her with more oil. They pressed charms to her skin, unaware that the act only sealed in the heat of her final fever. She died that night, her body bloated beneath the sheen of sacred balm. The silk was never removed. It became her shroud. After death, her body was revered. The silk clinging to her was burned in a pyre for offerings. The scent of her final breath mingled with cedar smoke. It was considered holy. The priests chanted. The air thickened. No one saw the tragedy, only the ritual. Death had become performance, and yet it continued. One wife died and another took her place. The same oils were opened. The same silks unfolded. The ritual repeated with precision and blindness. The temple servants, loyal but unknowing, honored tradition as infection slid silently through hallways. There was no questioning. To doubt the oils was to doubt the gods. To wash silk in fire or boil was heresy. So they continued, generation after generation, wrapping royalty in death and calling it holiness. Suffering was sanctified. Fatal customs were fossilized. The wives were loved, dressed, adorned, worshipped. But in truth, they were also poisoned by silk and made sick by sacred oils. Death did not need daggers in the court of pharaohs. It needed only a vial of perfume and a fold of untouched linen. The most dangerous things were not what they feared, but what they loved. There once was a time when scent meant nothing more than the wind's whim across the Nile, when the body held no perfume but sweat and soil. But in the veiled world of queens and consorts, fragrance became a costume, layered until even truth could no longer find a way through. The women of the palace wore oils like armor, a second skin that shimmered and whispered, intoxicating to those who passed by, but it was not their truth, it was a mask. And over time, that mask replaced their memory of who they were beneath it. The palace halls carried the thick breath of resins and incense. Cedar, frankincense, myrrh, all mingled in a syrupy fog that clung to skin, seeped into fabric, and filled lungs. At first it was ceremonial, then it was necessary. A wife who entered a chamber without scent was considered lacking, impure, not yet ready to be seen. So they bathed in scent, poured it onto their bodies until their natural musk was drowned, as though truth itself were something to be cleansed. Some women forgot how they once smelled. The scent of their own skin, after laughter, after weeping, after running barefoot in the courtyard dust, was replaced by lotus oil, perfumed wine, and ground petals suspended in honey. They no longer knew what their lovers truly embraced. The kiss was always flavored with cinnamon, the neck always polished with balm, their own selves forgotten beneath layers of ritual. It was not that they rejected truth, but truth was not welcomed in the palace. Truth stank of blood and anxiety, of childbirth and digestion, of waking up afraid and unwashed. It was the smell of the body before the maid touched it, before the oil, before the linen wrap. In a place where women were expected to look eternal, truth had no place, so they silenced it with the strongest fragrance they could afford. At first, the scent brought power. A particular blend, known only to a queen and her handmaid, could intoxicate a pharaoh to distraction. One drop behind the ear and he would forget his other wives. 2 drops on her thighs and he would forsake war. But over time, the oils thickened, spoiled, turned rancid. Still, they were applied. The scent remained, ritual demanded it. The memory of its original sweetness kept the truth at bay. Young girls entering the court were taught to fear their scent. They were told that men would turn from them if they were not masked in oils, that gods would not hear their prayers unless they reeked of temple balm, that even the dead would reject them without fragrance. So they obeyed, and day by day, their skin forgot how to breathe without it. The truth began to rot beneath the oils. Rashes, infections, sores hidden under golden gowns. Women whispered of strange itches that no prayer could soothe. But no one stopped. To stop would be to stand naked in front of judgment, to face the truth of decay. Better to perfume the rot than reveal it. Some women mourned their memories. They longed for the scent of wet grass or their mother's cooking, but the air around them smelled only of melting wax and camphor. Their children, too, learned to recognize them not by voice or gaze, but by the scent left on pillows and robes. The mother became the fragrance, and when she died, the oil was kept long after the body was gone. Even the dead were not spared. Corpses were anointed with the same balms used in life. The truth of their death, the smell of organs unraveling, of blood turned sour, was drowned beneath layer after layer of fragrance. Mourning was conducted not in silence, but in clouds of incense that burned for days. Scent was used to smother grief, to hide the truth that all things end. In the palace, there was a woman once known for walking without perfume. Her skin smelled of sun and bread, of water fetched from clay jars. The other wives called her blasphemous, but the pharaoh loved her. He said she reminded him of the world beyond these walls, but she died young. They said a spirit entered her through her bare skin. After that, her story was erased. Her scent was banned. The high priestesses dictated which oils were appropriate for which ceremony. Each had meaning: purity, protection, seduction. But the oils were harvested by men far from the temple, pressed with unwashed hands, stored in jars that had housed fish or urine. The final product might glimmer, but it carried more truth than anyone realized, and yet no one questioned its sanctity. When women aged, their scent changed. The oils no longer clung to their skin the same way. Some said the gods were turning away from them. They would apply more, desperate to retain divine favor. But the fragrance, once alluring, became overwhelming. The palace whispered. The scent that once hid truth now revealed it: old age, desperation, fear. In moments of illness, the oils would choke rather than heal. Fever made the fragrance unbearable. Yet servants were instructed to keep applying them, so guests would not smell sickness. Women suffocated beneath beauty. Some died before their time, smothered by love in the form of scent. Children born in these halls cried when they were bathed in oil for the first time. It burned their skin, but their mothers insisted it was the way, better to cry now than be shunned later. And so truth was taught to be painful, to be hidden, to be replaced by what pleased the eye and the nose. The priests wrote songs about the sacred scent of queens. They said a single whiff could open the gates of heaven. But these songs were written by men who never saw the boils beneath silk, who never tended the wounds hidden under gold. Their verses preserved fantasy, while the women suffered in silence behind closed doors. Some wives collected their oils like memories, each jar a gift, a moment, a secret, but over time the labels faded. They forgot which scent came from which lover, which festival, which child's birth. Their truth, once stored so carefully, dissolved into a muddle of indistinct sweetness. The linen pouches used to carry oils often turned black with mold. Still, they were kept, reused, worshipped. The decay inside never mattered as long as the outside shimmered. Such was the way of life in the palace, rot cloaked in gold, truth buried beneath ritual. One woman tried to cleanse herself. She asked the servants not to oil her. She wanted to know what she truly smelled like. They thought she was cursed. They avoided her. When she died, they buried her in the thickest perfumes they had, as if to erase her rebellion even in death. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when a woman would stand alone by the river at dawn and breathe in the wind untouched by incense. Her eyes would close. Her hands, no longer sticky with resin, would tremble. In that brief moment, the truth would kiss her skin. But by the time she returned to the palace, the scent was already gone. In scrolls now faded, some scribes wrote of these women, not their names, but their scent. She carried the fragrance of shadows, one wrote, like the breath of forgotten reeds. These were the only records of their true selves, hidden in metaphors that no one now understands. Today, the jars of oil found in tombs still smell faintly sweet. The world marvels at how they lasted, how the scent endured. But no one asks what was lost in that preservation. No one wonders what truth was hidden beneath the layers. The scent remains, but the woman does not. In the end, it was not the oil that cursed them. It was the fear of being known without it, the dread that the body alone was not enough. The palace demanded divinity, and scent offered the illusion. But it was a lie, and like all lies, it consumed what was real. The forgotten scent of truth is still there, perhaps waiting, not in jars, not in scrolls, but in the empty air between prayers and perfumes. In the moments just before the oil touches the skin, in the hush before ritual begins, in the silence that follows when no one breathes it in.